Go.
Hello and welcome to the first of a series of in our Doctoral Consortium episodes on architecture and philosophy. This particular session, we will be dealing with Raymond Ruyer, and I'm delighted to have Andrej Radman and Stavros Kousoulas with us, two old friends who have been with us before. And I would note that Andrej is the DigitalFUTURES Mark Cousins Theory Award holder for the year 2023, a very distinguished list of individuals. Just to say something about the Doctoral Consortium initiative, it's part of DigitalFUTURES itself. DigitalFUTURES has been set up as a kind of educational initiative, a kind of para-educational initiative, shall we say, where we offer ideas, information, educational ideas for free to students around the world, trying to break through barriers that might otherwise prevent them from having access to these kinds of ideas. And the Doctoral Consortium is a particular initiative that recognizes that often people working in the area they're doing their doctoral research are working remotely in small groups of individuals. So by creating a global platform, we can bring everyone together and share information and share indeed our passion for the particular topic. It was launched at it's our third year, and we kicked off with the amazing Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, followed by having people like Sanford Quinto, who I'm hoping will be joined today, Manuel Delander, and several other luminaries from the world of architecture. And then we went on to dealing with, let's say, some of the kind of the canon, some of the names within the canon of philosophy, figures such as Deleuze, Simondon, Michel Foucault, Julia Kristeva, and so on. We're now, in a way, opening up to, I think, a new set of thinkers. Raymond Ruyer himself is someone who had an enormous influence in French intellectual circles, a particular impact on Deleuze, Guattari, and Simondon himself, but not so well known, I would say, to an Anglophone audience, partly because his works were not translated until relatively recently. Broadly speaking, his particular area could be described broadly. We'll find out more about this, but embryology, biology, informatics, and he's the author, for example, of a book on cybernetics and the origins of information that clearly has a particular resonance in a world in which we are operating right now, the world of AI and so on. Today's session then will be, we have a Zoom audience here. We also have a YouTube audience. So the Zoom audience can ask questions directly of the doctoral researchers in our group. And the YouTube audience can send your questions in towards the end. We will, as I say, post this onto our YouTube channel, where we have posted all of our previous ones. But we're just noting just now that our session on Donna Haraway has got close to 40,000 views. So let's hope we are offering a very important service. And I think that, quite frankly, to have a session on a figure who's been so important but so overlooked by, certainly particularly by the Anglophone audience, is vitally important. I'm hoping this will be able to sort of readjust the balance. We'll be kicking off with Andrej, and then Stavros after him. I guess the presentation is roughly 40 minutes each, but it's important to have this out there, and then we'll have a discussion about it afterwards. So welcome, Andrej. Welcome, Stavros. It's really great to have you here. I kind of just thank again the TU Delft community. You're really establishing yourself, I think, as one of the leading critical centers of rigorous theoretical research in Europe and also the world at large. So it's great to have you. Thank you, Andrej. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I just want to make sure that I'm sure. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Perfect. So it is really great to be back after Simondon, Bergson, and now Raymond Ruyer. Stavros and I engaged with Ruyer's work more thoroughly at our 7th Ecologies of Architecture PhD Advanced Research Seminar in 2020 during the Corona pandemic, as you can see by my looks. It was called Everybody Loves Ruyer, the Architecture of Neo-Finalism. I'm not sure that everybody knows Ruyer, let alone loves him, but it's high time we put him on the architectural map, as Neil has already suggested. A step in this direction has been made by my colleague and friend Stavros in his recently published monograph, Architectural Technicities, a foray into larval space that features not only Ruyer, but also Simondon and Bergson. We also draw on the Raymond Ruyer in our recent co-authored article for the very first volume in the new TU Delft Open Book Series, Ecologies of Architecture, titled The Space of Technicity, subtitle Theorizing Social, Technical, and Environmental Entanglements, with contributions by John Protevi, Bruce Clark, Sha-Shin Wei, among others. Ruyer was a very prolific writer. He published over 100 papers and more than 20 books. So far, only 3 of those books have been translated into English. Neo-Finalism, 1952, The Genesis of Living Forms, 1958, and recently the Cybernetics on the Origin of Information, 1954 originally. In my presentation, I will be referring to the first 2 only, because upon receiving an invitation by Neil and Michael, I immediately ordered the cybernetic book that had just been translated, I believe, last year, December, but it arrived too late to be incorporated into my presentation. I hope you're not too disappointed because of this. But judging by the intro, I have read the intro, it is still incredibly timely. And I've seen online that people such as Joel White are reading it, so I guess very soon we can expect essays on it. Secondary literature. There hasn't been a vast secondary literature on Ruyer. I'd like to single out a few of my favorite sources. First, it's Ronald Bogue's entry from Deleuze's Philosophical Lineage book from 2009, edited by Graham Jones and John Roth, who is the translator of the Genesis book of Ruyer's, and I find it particularly helpful. Then Paul Baines' wonderful article on subjectless subjectivities from Brian Masumi's A Shock to Thought from 2002, and also his subsequent book, The Primacy of Semiosis, an Ontology of Relations from 2006, which I really, really strongly recommend. Then Elizabeth Grotz, she devoted a whole chapter on Raymond Ruyer in her book from 2017, the title The Incorporeal, Ontology, Ethics, and the Limits of Materialism. The title of her chapter is Ruyer and an Embryogenesis of the World, which starts with the curious epigraph from Ruyer's article from There is no subconscious embryogenesis and memory. And this article spells, the epigraph spells, memory is not the property of bodies. Bodies, or what appears as bodies, are the property of memory. It's very curious, beautiful. Then Smith, one of the translators of the cybernetic book and our keynote speaker at the forthcoming Deleuze and Guattari conference in July in Delft, and of course one of our favorite scholars in general. He wrote a great review for Paresia in 2007 titled Raymond Ruyer and the Metaphysics of Absolute Forms. I should perhaps add to the list, it's not here on the screen, an introduction to the neo-finalist, the translation, the English version of the neo-finalism by Mark Hansen. In 2017, the Deleuze and Guattari Studies Journal published a special issue on Simondon and Ruyer, edited by Andrew Iliadis and with contributions by Bogue himself, Roth, the translator that I mentioned, Yuk Hui, and other people. An excellent treatment of Ruyer as belonging to the tradition of so-called passive vitalism is provided by Claire Holbrook in her book, Deleuze and the Meaning of Life from 2016. A great book. Just a very brief reminder, this comes directly from her distinction, the distinction between what she means by active vitalism as opposed to passive vitalism. So active vitalism, Holbrook says, in the beginning, we have created the world, we subjected ourselves to systems, and now we have to reclaim the world that we have created. By contrast, now we go to passive vitalism. In the beginning, there is a system. This system, as we will see, is what Ruyer means by primary form. It is through the system that we think. One has to understand the emergence of the system. One has to understand the morphogenesis, in other words. More recently, just last year, in 2023, Audrone, I have to be careful, I'm not sure how to pronounce her surname, Zhukauskaite, included a chapter on Ruyer's organic consciousness in her organism-oriented ontology. A triple O, which could not be more different from Graham Harman's. From a more architectural point of view, apart from Stavros, I include two more Ruyerian writings, even though they do not mention Ruyer by the name. First, Manuel de Landa's seminal Non-Organic Life from 1992 in Jonathan Crary's and Sanford Quinter's Zone 6 incorporations, and Quinter's short but powerful piece from Phylogenesis FOA's arc from 2003 titled "Who is Afraid of Formalism?" And I quote from this short article. The poverty of what is today collectively referred to as by the misnomer formalism is more than anything else the result of a sloppy conflation of the notion of form with that of object. The form problem from the time of the pre-Socratics to the late 20th century is in fact an almost unbroken concern with the mechanisms of formation, the processes by which discernible patterns come to disassociate themselves from a less finely ordered field. This is what Simondon, of course, calls individuation and Deleuze calls becoming. Form, Sanford continues, when seen from this perspective, is ordering action, a logic deployed, while the object is merely the latter's sectional image, a manifest variation on an always somewhat distant theme. And mind you, just I underscored the theme because it will come back. The form of the object or the form of expression and the form of the theme, form of the content, are in truth in continual dynamic resonance, and when graphed together by formalist analysis, open up onto a field of limitless communications and transformations, end quote. I would only replace communication and transmission with transmonadic delaying or transindividual transduction, because we've got too much communication as it is. As Deleuze and Guattari say, what we actually lack is the resistance to the present, is the resistance to platitudes. In any case, as we will see, Quinter's choice of the term theme, which I believe appears also in Stavros's title of his presentation, could not be more Ruyerian. I cannot, of course, conclude my list of references without mentioning Deleuze and Guattari themselves. Not only because they are to be credited for the rekindling of Ruyer's line of flight, but also because, as with my previous interventions with Simondon and Bergson, I personally got to Ruyer via Deleuze and Guattari. Very quickly, Ruyer is first mentioned in Deleuze's Difference and Repetition in 1968. So the motto that you see on the screen, "The world is an egg," is Ruyerian through and through. In Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari, 1972, Deleuze and Guattari developed his distinction between the molecular form and molar structure. This is the distinction that Quinter makes between a theme and an object, the distinction. Ruyer features in 1,000 Pathos, of course, in 1980, and The Fold, which was published in 1988. But most prominently in What is Philosophy, a collaboration between Deleuze and Guattari from 1991, where they discuss the brain as the junction and not the unity of the three planes, the three so-called daughters of chaos: philosophy, science, and art. This concerns, of course, our discipline of architecture, because I would like to see it as irreducible to either of the three daughters of chaos. And I was pleased to see that Sven Olof Wallenstein recently made this case in his essay called The Invention of Space from 2023. To invent is to transform. So in any case, Ruyer's influence on Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy of biology and ontology as a whole simply cannot be overestimated. To continue the good formalist tradition of not conflating the object with the theme, we shall follow Ruyer, who came to insist on the distinction between structure or the disposition and operation of already functioning components, and form, or the self-generating and self-sustaining relation among elements, such as one encounters in biological entities. As Bogue rightly points out, Ruyer's oeuvre may be described as a meditation on the distinction between the virtual form and the actual aggregates, to go with the more familiar neo-materialist trope, and its implications in the domain of epistemology, ontology, axiology, and even theology. Curiously, like my own grandfather, from 1940 to 1945, Ruyer was interned at a German army prisoner of war camp for officers. Unlike my grandfather in this prison camp, Oflag 17A in Austria, the inmates, many of them distinguished scholars, established their own university. Besides teaching his own courses, Ruyer thus advanced his studies in embryology with a couple of eminent scientists of the day, which set him on the path of philosophy of biology. This, in turn, led him to develop a general theory of values, which he articulated in World of Values from 1948, one book, and another one, Philosophy of Value from 1952. Unfortunately, neither of these have been translated into English, but I have been exposed to Ruyer's axiology through the work of Brian Massumi. Most explicitly, in his chapter in Eric Horl's General Ecology from 2017, titled Virtual Ecology and the Question of Value. And implicitly in his 99 thesis, Massumi's 99 thesis on the revaluation of value, a post-capitalist manifesto from 2018. Allow me just to quickly read diagonally just a few for you to get a flavor of this book and some of the theses. So he says, in thesis 1, it is time to take back value. For many, value has long been dismissed as a concept so thoroughly compromised as to be unredeemable. Value is too valuable to be left in the hands of purveyors of normativity. Then in thesis 2, he says, in the absence of a strong alternative conception of value, it is all too easy for normative gestures to slip back in. I'll skip one, so thesis 4, to take back value is to revalue value beyond normativity and standard judgment. You can see the Nietzschean influence here. Thesis 5, the first task of the revaluation of value is to uncouple value from quantification. And this is why I think we will see why is it important for us to distinguish the molecular from the molar. Finally, thesis 6, the revaluation of value is irreducibly qualitative. It must be insistently this-worldly. And I think by this-worldly, we can assume that he means immanent, ethical, non-moralistic, so that the transcendence is done away with. So what binds the thesis that I just read out, and all 99 of them, in fact, is the Ruyer's epigraph that from the philosophy of value that Massumi chooses for his essay that I just mentioned to you. Value resembles a dance, not a statue. And I'm sure that Albert North Whitehead would fully agree. Translated to architectural parlance, and now in a kind of situationist tone, under the morphology, the morphogenesis, under the structure, the form. That's why Deleuze and Guattari, in their 1,000 Plateaus, adopt and adapt the Nietzschean title on the genealogy of morality for one of their plateaus called the geology of morals. Who does the earth think it is? It's the famous plateau number 3, illustrated by the lobster. God is a lobster with double articulation that Pinter mentions in his Who is Afraid of Formalism, when he draws the distinction between the form of expression and the form of content. So it is not about the given, morphology, but about how the given is given, or morphogenesis. That's the dance bit. One could also, this brings to mind the distinction that Spinoza makes between natura naturata and natura naturans, naturing and natured nature. In any case, the theory of value cannot ever reach some final resting point. That's the dance. It must follow the process of becoming of values. As Dan Smith would say, values are produced like cars or shampoo. After this extended introduction, in what follows, I will briefly sketch 5 Ruyerian concepts that will be hopefully of interest to architects, namely neo-finalism, equipotentiality, morphogenesis, absolute survey, and primacy of activity. So we start with the first one, neo-finalism, which in my reading, of course, is related to the issue of the problem of value, where value is defined as that which motivates or even better catalyzes activity. As Alicia Guerrero argues in her latest book, Context Changes Everything, How Constraints Create Coherence from 2023, our Western mechanicist and substantialist tradition has slowly but surely reduced the whole of causality to the efficient cause. If the efficient cause qualifies as upward causation, with the bathwater of unwanted determinism, we gradually threw out the baby of downward causation, or what Didier de Baïs calls the lure of the possible, or the lure of the virtual. This is the incorporeal yet real, the virtual. Just to remind ourselves, very simple example, the Aristotelian approach would have compelled us to consider not only the cake maker as the efficient cause, but also the ingredients, eggs, flour, etc., as the material cause, the birthday as the formal cause, and finally, pun intended, the cake as the final cause. Please note that the first one, so the efficient cause and the material cause are energetic, and the latter ones, the formal cause and the final cause, could be seen as incorporeal, but informational. We can also replace the 4 causes to bring it closer to architecture and say, so you have the architect as the efficient cause, building material as the material cause, the dwelling as the formal cause, and the house itself as the final cause, you name it. But in his schizoanalytic cartographies, Guattari dramatizes these 4 causes and turns them into 4 ontological domains, thus replacing linear causality with what we may refer to as the convivial appetition of quasi-causality. The concept of quasi-causality first appears in Deleuze's Logic of Sense in 1969, and he defines it as the causal contribution of the virtual. Again, virtual is incorporeal. According to Bernard Stiegler, and I really agree with this, this is perhaps the greatest contribution on the part of Deleuze, the idea of quasi-causality. So the emphasis is thus not on the structure, but on the transductive, on the transduction or relaying between, first, the pathic territories, which are now, we could see them as quasi-efficient cause, the existential flows, quasi-material cause, the diagrammatic machinic phyla, quasi-formal cause, and the synaptic universes of value, or the quasi-final cause. So he's making it even more complex. I will not go into detail here. For those interested, I published on this in my essay on architectural allegmatics, but I also did touch on it in my presentation on Simondon. To my mind, Guattari's transmonadism is indebted to Ruyer's philosophy of biology, which could not be So to my mind, Guattari's transmonadism is indebted to Ruyer's philosophy of biology, which could be and has been described as Leibniz-inspired panpsychism. Perhaps, as Taylor Atkins says in his podcast, Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour on neo-finalism, perhaps this should be considered a semi-panpsychism, because not everything is endowed with consciousness. Aggregates are not. We will see in a minute what is it that I mean by this. In any case, Ruyer himself preferred the term neo-finalism since panpsychism carries the connotations of what Colebrook calls active vitalism, and that he sought to avoid. With the prefix neo, he is distancing himself from the classical finalism, entelechy and teleology, this idea of a blueprint that gets us from an acorn to an oak tree, very deterministic, teleological. Bluntly, therefore, I I put it to you that the neo-finalism is to finalism what gnostiology is to epistemology. It's about this braided causality, which is not linear. Ruyer famously described his position as the inverse of epiphenomenalism, a critique directed towards Husserlian phenomenology. The mistaken assumption in most analysis of consciousness is that it must be observed as an object in order to be understood. For Ruyer, as well as for Bergson, consciousness is not of something. This is the idea of aboutness or Brentano's intentionality. Rather, it is something. And a small footnote for the comparison between, for those who are interested in the distinctions, comparison between Ruyer and Henry Bergson, I recommend Posteraros and John Roth's paper from 2019 in Angelaki called Instinct, Consciousness, Life, Ruyer contra Bergson. Ruyer illustrates the point by reference to Abbott's book Flatland from 1884, which depicts creatures inhabiting a two-dimensional space, such as the surface of a piece of paper. If they came across what would we describe as a circle inscribed on the surface, as we see here, they would experience it as an impenetrable wall, because they're 2D creatures. However, if an inhabitant of Flatland were able to rise above the surface into the third dimension, it would have no difficulty climbing the circular wall and getting a full understanding of Flatland's geometrical characteristics. Abbott thus proposes that the fourth dimension would provide the same transformed perspective for those of us inhabiting a three-dimensional world. Ruyer finds this the parable utterly problematic when applied to consciousness. There is no need of assuming the necessity of something like a four-dimensional observer. He provides an even more relatable example of a person seated at a checkboard patterned table, looking at the surface, as we see here on this slide. The standard assumption is that in order to describe consciousness, one must evoke what is known as homunculus, this idea that there's always the eye behind the eye, which of course leads to the problem of infinite regress, since the additional eye would have to be observed by yet another eye and yet another eye ad infinitum. As with the painter, and this is directly from neo-finalism, all these examples and images and diagrams, as with the painter who would have to include themselves in the painting of a painting of a painting of a painting, again, ad infinitum. This is the point that he's making over and over in chapter number 9. Yet, this is not how consciousness operates, Ruyer insists. The seated person is in immediate, so not mediated, in immediate possession of the table surface. In fact, there is no difference between the perceiving subject and perceived object. That is to say, between having a perception and being the perception. Once again, in stark contrast to phenomenology, consciousness is not consciousness of something, consciousness is something. The conscious quote-unquote self-enjoyment of 2D surface entails no supplementary third dimension. This is what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as the N+1 moment. This is exactly what architects do every time they employ a so-called Cartesian box with the X, Y, Z axis. In order to study an object, we have this tendency of wrapping it up, thus always relying on a supplementary edit dimension. So, but Ruyer is against this. He says, so we don't need to do that, nor does the self-enjoyment relate the details of the surface in the previous example by simple contiguity. For consciousness, all the squares, the checkerboard, are grasped at once without reducing their multiplicity to an undifferentiated unity. In Ruyer's words, it is an absolute surface which is relative to no point of view exterior to itself, which knows itself without observing itself. And this, again, as opposed to n+1, so a supplementary dimension, this is actually descending, it's n-1, which is related to differential calculus and topology. And this is why I include the image of Gauss. And for this more extensive, let's say, treatment of this, I recommend Delanda's Intensive Science and Virtual Philosophy. So when considered from a vantage point of a single square, we are back to the idea of the checkerboard. The table's checkerboard squares are interrelated by mere contiguity. Yet, what holds all of them together are liaisons, or relations, that are always inferred and never observed. The difference between structure and form comes to the fore. While structure may be observed, but only as a collection of entities partes extra partes, his favorite Latin term, form is a multiplicity whose liaisons cannot be observed. Most scientific analysis of phenomena, focused as they are on observation, deal with structures and actually ignore forms. What is implicit in such analysis is a mechanistic understanding of the world as a collection of entities interacting de proche en proche, which is to say from close to close. This comes very close to Karan Bharat's agential realism, where she's again contrasting interaction, so already constituted terms that are related, with something that she names interaction. We will see that what Bharat and Ruyer have in common is their keen interest in quantum physics. So to conclude the idea, the point of neo-finalism, we are, by we I mean architects, are really good at the logic of discreteness, or the given. And by the way, data also is the given. But we have yet to adopt the logic of continuity, and this advocated by Charles Sanders Peirce. So we have yet to adopt the idea of form or information. Second concept, equipotentiality. According to Ruyer, every self-forming form is a subject, it's an I. So we may say of every complex living organism, that every I is made of all other I's. Every I is a colony, both psychological and biological. I think this is what Jean-Luc Nancy calls the being singular plural. Given the colonial nature of complex self-forming forms, it is no wonder that morphogenesis entails risks, perils, which in turn entail improvisation and invention. So this is not to architecture as heteropoiesis, not autopoiesis. In the phenomenon of equipotentiality, Ruyer thus finds evidence against preformationism, this is related to classical finalism, and in favor of morphogenetic invention and improvisation. Yeah, one could actually say that classical finalism is about executing a plan. It's like a plan as a blueprint, as I said, from acorn to oak tree. And here we are getting closer to something that could be described as and has been described by Deleuze and Guattari by reference to this concept of the plane of immanence. So from plan as a blueprint to the plane of immanence, and a point was being made already by Michael Speaks in his introduction to Bernard Cash's Earth Moves from 1995, where he distinguishes between the realization of the possible, which is always redundant, that would be the plan executed, as opposed to actualization of the virtual, which is always creative. Early in embryological studies, researchers found that grafting cells from one sector of an embryo into another, or even from another embryos, did not necessarily disrupt normal morphogenesis. If the graft was made early in development, the cell often simply assumed the function appropriate to its new location in the embryo. If, however, the graft was made later in the development, when the threshold was reached, the grafted cell developed as if it were in its old position. This suggested that initially embryonic cells are equipotential, and today we would say pluripotential, capable of developing in a number of ways to become a lung, a foot, or an eye. We know this, of course, from the contemporary research on stem cells. As development proceeds, cells become more specified in their function. So for Ruyer, equipotentiality thus becomes a synonymous with consciousness, described as self-forming form into auto-overflight of an absolute surface. What is interesting then is that in humans, a good deal of equipotentiality continues to exist in the brain throughout an individual's life. It is undisputable that the brain functions as distributed across intricate, modifiable, and not strictly localizable networks with a remarkable plasticity in remembering, learning, reasoning, inventing, and etc. Of course, the concept of plasticity has recently been revamped by the research of Catherine Malabou. Ruyer concludes that the brain in the adult organism actually remains embryonic. As such, the human brain is just one manifestation of the process of self-formation that pervades the physical world. In other words, Ruyer's concept of self-forming form extends into the world at large. In the words of a famous line from Deleuze and Guattari from What is Philosophy? Not every organism has a brain, and not all life is organic, but everywhere there are forces that constitute microbrains or an inorganic life of things. Third concept, morphogenesis. To understand morphogenesis, we must turn to Ruyer's concept of verticalism. It is relatively simple to grasp an organism's morphology, which of course there is an analogy here with architectural typology, so that's easy. That is the structure and functioning of the diverse components, but morphogenesis is much more difficult to fathom. We may treat the organism as a complex machine with an already formed parts operating in regular circuits of interaction. However, an organism is a machine that builds itself. And during its self-construction, it manages to function even at stages when it lacks the parts essential to the functioning of the completed machine, such as the human embryo, which manages to survive while building the brain, heart, and lungs, without which it cannot live once it's born. And again, there's no blueprint for that. We may observe various, of course, stages of morphogenesis, perhaps photographing a limb, hand, at representative moments as a hand gradually emerges and takes on its fully developed shape. And we may then sequentially arrange those photographs, as we do here, along a horizontal line, as much as similar to what Muybridge would do. But we will thoroughly misconstrue the growth process if we do not add what Ruyer calls a vertical dimension to our analysis, one that recognizes the continuous goal-directed activity that coordinates the multiple processes of morphogenesis in the unified task of shaping a hand. The hand is not formed simply like our snapshots on the timeline, point by point, the proche on proche, but by an accretion of, it's not built like this by accretion of contiguities. Rather, the incipient hand, the one hand, and the completed hand are starting point and the end point of a continuous line of development, best thought of as something like a musical melody. We will be hearing about this, I think, in Stavros' presentation. This musical melody is the theme that Quinter mentions in the Who's Afraid of Formalism. The actual performed melody, then, would be a temporal unfolding of an atemporal melody, idea. Similarly, one of the four OG speculative realists, Quentin Meillassoux, more recently attempted a diagram that would distinguish between the chronological horizontal dimension, literally what you see from left to right, and the transtemporal vertical dimension in Ruyer's terms, depicted here by the transversal or transductive diagonal line. So the vertical is, in this case, this transductive line that falls out of phase with itself, not to be confused with the horizontal line. According to Ruyer, a vertical atemporal developmental melody idea directs the morphogenesis of every self-replicating organism. Hence, if a genuine form is self-sustaining activity, then an organism is also a self-sustaining and self-shaping activity, driven by what the contemporary biological anthropologist Terence Deacon calls teleodynamism in his book from 2011, The Incomplete Nature. A self-forming form that builds itself is an atemporal absolute surface in auto-overflight, unfolding chronologically as a developmental melody. It cannot be stressed enough that Ruyer is not advocating a conventional idealism. For a developmental melody is not an idea residing in some eternal great beyond transcendence. Rather, it never loses contact with the spatio-temporal plane. I think this is very important. Even though it is not constrained to actualize in space the totality of the structure which is capable of constructing. At an embryo's conception, for example, its developmental melody exists largely as a potential form. So everything you see on this diagram, which is below the surface, which is white. An embryo's conception, for example, its developmental melody exists largely as a potential form, only minimally actualized. You see that the gray, the first on the left element with this minimally actualized, the gray bit. But as organism grows, developmental melody becomes increasingly embodied. It gets more and more actualized in the spatio-temporal world. So there is a threshold. Once it's crossed, we get something. I mean, all the potentiality collapses into the actual given shape and not form. As we have seen, I mean, slowly moving to the fourth concept, the absolute survey. For Ruyer, consciousness is a self-forming form in overflight, in French it's souvent, across an absolute surface or absolute domain. Absolute survey constitutes self-enjoyment. This term comes from Samuel Alexander, Australian philosopher, which does not designate pleasure. So self-enjoyment is not about pleasure, it's about immediacy without immediate objectification. Here we are talking about the non-dimensional, fully directional space. Forms are to be contrasted with aggregates, collections of disconnected things, such as a bucket of sand or a set of billiard balls on a pool table that take on various shapes according to mechanical laws. Many of the phenomena in our world do involve the interaction of separate bodies, of course, as components of aggregates. What qualifies aggregates as structures rather than genuine forms is the fact that they are actually observable. Their constituents, relative positions to one another, and functions may be described, and the future states of their functioning may be predicted. Admittedly, most of the advances of modern science have come through the study of structures, as they have provided indispensable knowledge about the world. But they have also encouraged, fortunately, a mechanistic view of reality as nothing but a collection of discrete objects, interacting according to the laws of classical physics, which are now laws governing aggregates, dealt with probabilistic statistics. Ruyer recognized the importance of aggregates, but argued that the sciences based on their study are secondary. There's a twist here. Whereas those that study forms are primary sciences. So to be a little bit provocative, I put it to you that I consider civil engineering to be a study of structures, while architecture studies forms in Ruyerian terms. So we are not afraid of forms. There are three kinds of forms. By the way, John Ropp, I referred to him already as a translator and scholar, Ruyerian scholar. He recently proposed a fourth kind, but in spite of all the sophistication, I'm not convinced. In any case, form one is the primary form of atoms, molecules, and simple organisms such as protozoa. And this is the directional space, as I said, non-dimensional, fully directional space. I see it in terms of topology. Then we have forms two, secondary forms. These are forms of organisms endowed with the consciousness of. Earlier I said that in primary consciousness there is no consciousness is. Secondary consciousness is consciousness of with specialized perceptual organs and motor schematizations. This is related to Umwelt. This becomes a dimensional space to work schools idea where with creatures with the nervous system and how they arrange their Umwelt and their milieus. And then finally, form 3 is about the forms possessing the consciousness of consciousness. It is worth stressing that every form is a form 1, every single one. Every form 2 is thus both form 1 and form 2. And every humanoid with the consciousness of consciousness is at once form 1, form 2, and form 3. What is perhaps most appealing to architects, Ruyer sees that every form as an activity aimed as mastering, sees a form as a kind of aim, activity, the primacy activity here, aimed at mastering space and time, so that the simpler the form, the smaller its domain of space-time control. Conversely, of course, the movement from form 1 via form 2 to form 3 is one of increasing mastery of space and time in terms of flexibility and autonomy. This is the parallel to Bernard Stiegler's mnemonic exosomatization, this idea that the degrees of detachment of memory proper from the body itself is literally unavoidable. And I invite you to check the footprint we published a few years ago on epiphylogenesis, and also there is a roundtable on our Coaches Architecture YouTube on this topic. Anyway, using von Uexküll's concept of Umwelt, Ruyer lists the incremental changes evident in forms 1, 2, and 3, primary, secondary, and tertiary. From the amoeba's restricted domain of control to the broader domains of the spider, the mole, birds, and various territorial animals, to the extensive existential niche of humans. Each expansion of space-time control brings with it increased specialization of functions and increased freedom of activity. Finally, fifth concept, primacy of activity. Apart from his interest in embryology, Ruyer finds support of his view of consciousness as fundamental force of liaisons in the discoveries of quantum physics. He was a keen reader of Niels Bohr, and this puts him in direct contact with Karen Barat, who has in 2007 published this influential book, Meeting the Universe Halfway. The subtitle is Quantum Physics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning. Tentatively, you could say the entanglement of structure and form. According to quantum physics, atomic particles are less things than activities, zones of forces sustaining a given form. An atom is not a structure, but a structuring activity. And when atoms combine to form a molecule, the interacting electrons are not localizable. Atoms, in short, are genuine forms, self-sustaining activities in which there is no distinction between shape and force, between what is and what it does. Molecules have a structure since their components may be observed, but they too are forms, insofar as they are self-sustaining activities whose liaisons are unobservable. In other words, every form, from atoms to molecules, viruses, bacteria, and our cells, this much more complex organism, is a self-sustaining configuration of forces of connections, of liaisons. Each of these forms, according to Ruyer, is consciousness, but we are talking here about the non-anthropomorphic consciousness. As a footnote, Michael Turvey, a renowned Gibsonian scholar, convincingly argued in favor of quantum indeterminacy also at the meso level of affordances. I deal with this extensively in my article, Allegmatics of Architecture. In any case, equating form with consciousness may seem far-fetched, but Ruyer's point is not that all the attributes of human consciousness are present in atoms. That would be wrong. Rather, that human consciousness is merely a complex, highly developed, self-aware version of the primary self-forming activity that appears in varying degrees of complexity throughout the physical world. For example, the amoeba, the one that we saw in the initial slide, is such a self-sustaining form that exhibits the properties of a basic subjectivity. even though it lacks the specialized body components of a human being, including a central nervous system. Its actions exhibit the primary characteristics of consciousness: perception, self-generated and goal-oriented action, memory, learning, adaptation, and invention. We can only assume that Ruyer would have been delighted by the recent scientific discoveries which confirm his intuition, such as the one described in a recent paper, and I mean recent from maybe 2 weeks ago, with the telling title, "Brains are not required when it comes to thinking and solving problems. Simple cells can actually do it." To conclude, although Ruyer speaks of the actualization of potential rather than virtual forms, his entire philosophy, like that of Bergson, could be said to rest upon the notions of the virtual and the actual. Whether called potential or virtual, what is important in Ruyer's distinction between the vertical domain of self-forming forms and the horizontal domain in which they are actualized, that's the tension. No? So just as with the Deleuze and Guattari, I stress again and again, both virtual and actual are equally real. Just as Deleuze and Guattari in different, just as Deleuze in Difference and Repetition, 1968, describes the virtual in terms of ideas as problems. Again, I think anticipates Stavros' problem. Ruyer also refers to self-forming forms as ideas, emphasizing that they are not static Platonic forms. They are not idealist, but they are thematic activities, goal-oriented projections that constantly require improvised solutions to unanticipated problems. So again, talking about the plane of consistency rather than a plan of as a blueprint. As mentioned in the introduction, in Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari referred to Ruyer's neo-finalism to reiterate the difference between the molar and the molecular. Their formulation comes close to Ruyer's distinction between molar aggregates or structures and genuine self-forming forms, and I underscore, regardless of their size or complexity. It is also a common mistake to see the opposition between the molar and the molecular in terms of scale. In Ruyer's fibrous universe, as he calls it, a field of consciousness or subjectivity is first and foremost a domain of microscopic liaisons that assure the coherence of physical individuals. Since all organisms are made up of atoms and molecules, we may conclude that they are macro-microscopic beings. At any given scale, assemblages are macroscopic in relation to microscopic forms that constitute the given aggregate. Hence, we have to agree with Ruyer's tongue-in-cheek statement that the elephant is, despite all appearances, more microscopic than a soap bubble. Regardless of the actual scale of the entities under consideration, there is a qualitative difference between forms and aggregates. This dovetails with Deleuze and Guattari's repeated insistence that the fundamental distinction between the molar and the molecular is qualitative rather than quantitative, having nothing to do with size. So, to conclude, size does not matter. I thank you for your attention, and I give the screen to Stavros.
Neil, we go straight ahead, right? Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Straight ahead.
I don't interrupt the flow. That was fantastic.
Oh, no. Thank you, Andrej. And I also thank you for touching upon many of the things that I'll also be touching from a slightly different perspective. That's what makes it nice, always. Let me share my screen as well. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I suppose you can see it. Good. So yeah, no, there's no theme in the title, but there is, as Andrej mentioned, but there is a continuous reference to the theme of the theme, as Ruyer has it in his own work, and in many regards, I'm going to touch upon similar concerns that Andrej touched, but from slightly how can I call it? I'm used to be seeing Andrej's face smiling, so now I mean I can only assume that he would be smiling. No, but it's okay. You can leave it. It's because we're used to do these things. Most of the times we like to teach things together and to improvise together. So I would just say that I'm going to be touching it from a less, let's say, gentle perspective. So I'm not going to be giving so much background information as Andrej did, and so many secondary references as Andrej did. Andrej, you can chill and remove the video. There's no worry. I'm not going to oblige you to do that. A melody that sings itself. That's going to be the line that is going to be going throughout today. And I'm going to use and abuse Ruyer from the perspective of a question that was a question that I've been having before I even ran into Ruyer. For me, there is a quartet of thinkers which they can be roughly summed up. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari, I consider them as one. So Deleuze and Guattari is one of those thinkers. There is Bergson, there is Simondon, and then there is Ruyer. All these four thinkers, and in that I am agreement with Daniel Smith, they, in different times in the last century and from different entry points, they reintroduced a concern into philosophy that has been abandoned for hundreds of years before them. And that was a genetic concern. It was a concern about how things are produced, rather than examining how things are already given as givens. So it's not coincidence, therefore, but for Ruyer, one of his main, let's say, conceptual persona, to use the term that Deleuze and Guattari have used quite often, it's not a coincidence that for Ruyer, one of his main conceptual personas is the embryo. Okay, and Andrej already, in a way, referred to embryos. I'm also going to touch upon embryogenesis today a bit. But I'm going to touch upon embryogenesis, as I was mentioning, from the perspective of a problem that I've been thinking of and I've been dealing with before I encountered Ruyer sometime in the last decade, mainly when his books started to get translated to English, because unfortunately for me, or fortunately for others, I don't know, I cannot speak French, so I cannot read directly on the French sources. So this problem that I've been dealing with even before I encountered Ruyer was a relatively simple problem, but it has no simple answer. And that simple problem is how can we as architects, you can say designers if you want to be more broad about it, how can we as architects, how can we as designers, how can we be aware of what we are doing? So how can we be aware of the architectural act itself? How can we speak of a consciousness, quote unquote, or leave the quotes on, do whatever you want? How can we speak of a certain architectural consciousness that manages to examine, to survey past, present, and future, actual and virtual domains, minor and major aspects of our discipline of architecture, minor and major aspects of all the technicities, to use a Simondonian term, that we deploy when we are actually involved in the making of architecture, in architecting. And that's the question that I eventually used and abused, as I said, Ruyer, to attempt to respond to. Ruyer is an interesting guy in that sense when you speak of consciousness, because for Ruyer, consciousness is neither a distinct ingredient, it's neither a sort of superadded substance, transcendent, nor the attribute of a spiritual substance. So it's neither something that is added on the supposed subject, neither something that is found inside the supposed subject. Consciousness for Ruyer is only the act, so it's active, intelligent or instinctive organization according to a theme. So for Ruyer, consciousness is when activity organizes itself according to a theme. In other words, for Ruyer, consciousness cannot be separated from action, and both are the structuration and the operation of a theme. His philosophy of consciousness, Ruyer's philosophy of consciousness, moves simultaneously beyond any mind and body distinction, any subject and object binary, but also does that by distinguishing itself from traditional phenomenological accounts. Andrej mentioned Mark Hansen. Mark Hansen, in his introduction to neo-finalism, which I consider to be perhaps the most important book that Ruyer has published, at least the ones that are getting to be known to the English world. In his introduction to neo-finalism, Mark Hansen is mentioning that where phenomenology generically takes intentionality, the relation of consciousness to an object or the aboutness of consciousness, as a primitive element, Ruyer's philosophy of consciousness actually insists on an absolute sensation as its foundation. So sensation is the foundation of consciousness, according to Ruyer. Consciousness, according to Ruyer, does not have a visual or phenomenal, a la phenomenology, field as the intentional object of its activity. Consciousness is the field itself. So consciousness cannot take any presuppositions in any attempt to try to explain it. Therefore, consciousness, and Andrej spoke about that already, is never of something. One is never conscious of architecting, for example. Consciousness is something. So consciousness is the act of architecting, is the act of designing. It's not a presupposition of the act. And again, this is what I'm going to be touching upon today. How architectural consciousness, designerly consciousness, is structured and how it operates, how it manages to unite our present, the present of lived experience, with both the past, that's where we are supposedly coming from, and with the future, that's where supposedly we are going towards, and brings all these three together on the moment that it invents a form, that it expresses and invents a form. To do that, to use Ruyer in order to examine architectural consciousness, I will be touching mostly upon two elements of his thought, which I'm not going to explain in detail, but you will see them explained throughout, in their own way, throughout this short lecture. And these two themes, these two concepts of Ruyer is the transspatial and the transtemporal. Basically, transspatial meaning how consciousness cuts across spatial limits, and the transtemporal is how consciousness, all kinds of consciousness, not human consciousness, cuts through temporal limits. To do that, I will adopt, and again, Andrej mentioned this, I will adopt a general plea, a general, let's say, invite that Ruyer gave us on trying to understand from a renewed perspective a slightly unpopular philosophical tradition, and namely that tradition is finalism. You can hear it with names such as teleology, for example. Ruyer, close to Simondon, does not understand form as something static, but actually understands it as a dynamic in formation, as something that is in continuous formation. And to make this plea of his clear to us, he invites us to think of a traveler. I mean, Andrej can relate with that. He travels often from Brussels to Delft. He invites us, Ruyer, to think of a traveler that dresses up, hurries to the station, buys a ticket and boards on a train. Ruyer suggests, therefore, that the description of this movement of the traveler that hurries to the station trying to buy the ticket, understood as a succession of causes and effects, needs to be complemented with a description of the sense of that experience, as well as the end of the traveler's activity, the goal on behalf of the traveler. This sense of the experience of the traveler, as well as his or hers end, his goal or her goal, what they manage to do is that they are able to survey, examine the unfolding of causes and effects, while also organizing it into a signifying whole. In other words, all the notions we have described are characterized by what he's calling multiple unity, the multiplicity being realized as unity and considering itself as surveying. If not, then the unitas multiplex can be expressed with a single word form. So all these description, traveler, station, hiring, luggage, ticket, all these in their coming together, in the wholeness of their coming together, that's what Ruyer claims is form. Form is not a static shape or an outline. Every activity, every conscious existence has a form for Ruyer. And each product of finalist activity, of a goal-making activity, presents the observer with a complex structure. In the product structure, in contrast to the activity form, the multiplicity immanent to the form has indeed been realized, as in a machine in which the pieces assembled by the engineer propel one another. Again, this is important. For Ruyer, form is activity, and activity is form. Form is not something that comes afterwards. That's a very small percentage of what we can, it's the peak of the iceberg of what we can describe as form. For Ruyer, therefore, again, form is what an entity strives for. It's very close to what Spinoza would call a conatus, okay? It's sensational in the manner that we have seen Simondon defining sensation. It's actually grasping a direction, grasping a sense, rather than grasping an object, the outline of an object. And moreover, the invention of the form, and that's what should be of interest for us architects, either through technicities, this is what we do, or biological evolution, this is what the world around us does, it produces forms. Both those cases involve the resolution of a tension, of an intricate dance, let's say, between norms and values. Norms being the established ways that we do things, the normal, and values being the intended way that things should be done. Ruyer is grouping together these two things, the norms and the values, and he calls them, both coming together, he calls them directing essences. So norms and values, how things are done and how we would like them to be done, come together for Ruyer, and he calls them directing essences. They are opening up the direction that one needs to follow. For Ruyer, therefore, the issue is to examine how these directing essences can have a direction in the first place. Who chooses that direction, if anyone chooses it? Why invention takes a certain direction and not any other direction? Why one form is qualified over another form? To understand the directionality of forms and to understand the intentionality of this direction, Ruyer proposes us to think of it in terms of a mnemic theme. He will soon add that to this mnemic theme, we should make a note that it should not be seen as coming from the past, but actually as a mnemic theme, as a memory that comes from the future. And I will explain it in a bit. And not only this memory comes from the future, but actually there's no specific subject, there's no I, privileged subject, that embodies it. Speaking of a mnemic theme, and for those that are familiar with Bergson, they would recognize it immediately, Ruyer is directly influenced by him. The mnemic theme, even if he's not clearly saying so, is something that Ruyer takes from Bergson. A mnemic theme, it's not the emergence of a new present, a new actuality that changes the past. Rather, it is the contemporaneous visualization of the present, its shadow or memory, that makes the present part of the past, internally intertwined with it, changing the past as a result. This transformation of the past implies, in its case, a reorganization and redistribution of memories on the planes of the past, and hence a differently configured past. Far from being a static given, the mnemic theme consists of dynamic, and transformative planes. As such, memory is one different term, one could say, for what people like Deleuze have called the virtual, or for what people like Simondon have called the pre-individual. The mnemic theme is a pre-individual virtual theme, is a theme of potentialities. Through breaking space and through breaking time, there is no specific I or specific memory, but rather a universal I, a universal subject, and a universal memory that is continuously under invention, is continuously informing itself. This invention of a universal I, it's actually a rearrangement of the whole cosmos that does not erase itself when it's rearranging itself, and that demands that no experience refers exclusively to the present, but simultaneously to past and future. For Ruyer, any action that we're doing, including our designerly actions, or basically mostly our designerly actions, anticipate the future while also modifying the past. Similarly to Simondon's notion of autonormativity, which I'm not going to explain now, one can refer to the previous lectures that we had here with Andrej and Simondon, the step-by-step succession of instants builds only upon itself, and while also building its future self, constitutes the steps that we understand as norms, the steps that we understand as the given way to execute something, the given way to do something. Ruyer is explicit in that when he says that by pursuing senseful ends, aiming in senseful goals, I affirm on that very same moment that my activity has a sense. Consequently, what becomes crucial is the act of a step itself, is the act itself, the moment where the cosmos has not yet decided as to what it was and what it will be, what it will become. In every step of this dark cosmic forest, there is equiprobability, equivalency and equipotentiality, to use a term that Andrej mentioned before. It's not yet what it will become when it's put in relation with that mnemic theme, with the rhythms of our technicities, in the very present of their inventive and expressive capacities. Ruyer would claim that what is at stake is how can we be able to be placed in a circuit with themes that are not in space and time. So how can we engage with a memory that is not of our own and it's not of our current present experience? He connects, therefore, equipotentiality with what he terms self-survey. In fact, he claims actually that self-survey and equipotentiality are two synonymous terms. He does not hesitate to associate those two terms, self-survey and equipotentiality, with technicities, with the very ways that we engage with our environment, with the practices that squeeze out a consciousness that can survey itself and its virtual potentials. In his own words, the industrial construction of the steam engine rests on human consciousness, the domain of self-survey whose objective manifestation is the equipotentiality of the cortex, which extends embryonic potentiality. The mechanical step-by-step bonds of the machine rest on the primary self-bonding on the embryo. So you see, we have machines on the one hand, embryos on the other. Ruyer claims that they are both resting on one another. Chemical means and connectionist means in an internal circuit organization, industrial means in external circuit manufacturing. These techniques of organization and behavior presuppose a primary mode of unity by self-survey. That's Ruyer's first astounding proposition. Biological and machinic bonds have a shared profound capacity to survey the field of their subjective domains. And this field is a unitary field. It's not chunked on discrete pieces as any digital account of those might have had, as any dataified account might have had. What happens is actually that in some parts, this field is denser than others. There is biomachinic fields, which are fibrous. They are in a membranic state that differentiates them in terms of their intensity, of synaptic locations, moments that they come together. And in this coming together, the passage of the global memory of the cosmos can come through. And this is also why he is able, in this previous astonishing sentence, to put together steam engines and embryos in one single line. This is also why Ruyer can claim that organic, individual, and technological memory, and this is directly a quote from him, share fluid borders. What is a tool in some cases is an organ in others. Think of a pot on top of our gas furnace that is basically an externalized stomach. While the brain, is claiming, is nothing but an embryo that has not finished its growth, and the embryo is nothing but a brain that begins to organize itself before starting to organize the external world. Once again, for Ruyer, the importance in this fluidity of borders shares in the moment that they are getting dense with one another, in the moment that there is a synaptic passage with one another. If each domain is equally potential, and yet the field they form is shared and common, then these synapses correspond not only to the passages of the theme in that single domain, but also to potential passages of that theme in new domains, in domains that, as Simondon would say, have been transduced, have been produced by previous domains. So from one embryonic area to another, from one organic domain to a psychological, for example, from one mnemic theme to an I that is now a specific I, is my consciousness. This indeterminacy of equipotentiality is the sign of an actual and active cosmic consciousness. But however, since this indeterminacy, this equipotential first step, can be found in any subjective domain, from amoebas to humans, we should first of all dissociate consciousness from the brain itself and rather associate it with form rather than the brain. So this is also another astounding proposition that Ruyer is bringing forward. Ruyer is saying that consciousness is not of the brain, consciousness is not of the organism, consciousness is formal. And again, that's something that as architects should take very seriously. Consciousness is formal in the sense that it's informed by the way that a form, an individual, individuates, informs by producing itself, while also producing the environment that it will later on, only when it becomes consciousness of the brain, it will claim as its own product. The superiority of the brain, therefore, lies in the fact that it's an incomplete organ, an organ that remains sensitive to outside information. By being sensitive to that information, by being metastable, as Simondon would say, the brain constantly retains its equipotentiality, retains an active embryonic consciousness that can even then become the consciousness of the whole world that it attempts to manipulate. Being incomplete, the architectural brain, the designer brain, can both disrupt and intuit, disconnect and follow synapses in order to inform itself by forming itself and its environment. In this sense, what I've called elsewhere larval space unfolds from the capacity of a subjective domain to survey and examine its own form, to bring forth the emergence of a primary form of consciousness. Ruyer will claim that we must start from examining these subjective domains in order to understand how individuals can appear. He underlines that the reverse can never be true, since it will be impossible to understand how a subjective domain can be born from aggregates, from physical beings that are just bodies. Ruyer puts forward, therefore, the same invitation as Simondon put. To understand individuation, we must start from individuation itself and not from the finished end product, not from the individual. To understand architecture, one must start from architecting, the act of designing and producing architecture, rather than from the end product. However, unlike Simondon, Ruyer is perhaps a bit more daring or cared less, and he decided to take it one step further. Ruyer claims that emergence, invention, or any creative composition is possible because its parts do not interact as separate individuals, discrete individuals, but rather interact as subjective domains that are not distinct. Creation for Ruyer relies on the synaptic capacity of different domains to inform one another. And what is at stake when it comes to architectural creation is the capacity to survey, to examine in anticipation, these synaptic constraints, and while examining these synaptic constraints, intuit or disrupt a novel field of their cross-affectivity, of how they can affect one another. It's important, and this is also coming from Ruyer's Neo-Finalism book, this sketch that Andrej also presented previous versions of it. It's important to clarify what sort of survey Ruyer refers to. As Andrej was mentioning, most traditional accounts of perception always ask and demand an observer that is situated in an n+1 dimension. For these accounts, the observer exists in at least one more dimension of whatever is being observed, and they are able to see instantaneously all the parts of that being. Ruyer will claim, however, that this geometric law, which applies to the technique of perception, that is, to perception as a physiological event, is invalid to the actual experience of visual sensation as a state of consciousness. Put differently, one cannot indeed describe what is perceived when one is perceiving as discrete parts. That can be done only afterwards, only in a purely technical account of perception. One falls short when the task is to describe not what is perceived in perception, but rather when one attempts to move from a photographic observation towards an account of visual experience, or more broadly of experience itself. And that's very close to the thoughts of both Whitehead, but also of William James. When examining the last part, experience itself, the I, the subject, does not need to be placed outside of sensation in a dimension that is extra, opposed to it. The I simply acts sensation. The observed table, as you can see in there, when we examine it not as a static representation, but as a dynamic sense-giving, is no longer a composition of parts, but is what Ruyer was calling an absolute surface. Everything around us, when in experience, perceiving it, is an absolute surface. The way that this table is structured, the way it operates, the affective and intensive thresholds that inform the possibility of any action with it, are all observed in an absolute unity, which, as Ruyer clarifies, is neither a fusion nor a confusion. Sensation, in its own right as experience, is a proper form. Through form, and remember, form is consciousness, consciousness is form, Ruyer will connect immediately sensation with the development of consciousness. To clarify this, he will use the example of a very primitive life form, a protozoan, which, when compared with a human being, this protozoan does not have any proper sensory organ. It doesn't have eyes or noses or mouths that allow it to manipulate its environment and modulate itself. When it perceives itself, this protozoan will not perceive external forms that assist its self-enjoyment. Ruyer will add to that its field of consciousness will only be of its own organic form, which is in principle the entire universe for it. This organic form or primary consciousness is not vague or psychoid. It has no reason to be so. It can never even be myopic for itself, like a visual sensation in the secondary consciousness, because it's not our optical cortex that is myopic, but our eyes. For Ruyer, therefore, there is only one form of consciousness, primary consciousness as form in itself. This primary consciousness is found in every organism and is literally one with life. Since Ruyer claims that every organism is, at least at the very basis, capable of surveying its own form. Consequently, in the same sense that the brain is an incomplete organ, it's an embryo, but it's constantly sensitive to its outside information, this secondary consciousness emerging from the primary one, the one that human beings are familiar with, the one that we are familiar with, is nothing but, and that's also astonishing, is nothing but the primary consciousness of the brain. Our consciousness is formal, and our consciousness, the human consciousness, is the brain surveying itself. Since the cortex of our brains is modulated by external stimuli, sensory consciousness gives us the form of external objects that we perceive. Secondary consciousness can perceive the forms that it seeks to survey, even when these forms are beyond its own field of survey, while these forms, as established and intended norms and values, structure and organize the field itself. Apologies for the creepy smile here. Having grouped norms and values as directing essences, Ruyer understands them as ideals. However, the guiding ideal is simultaneously the organic type and the Umwelt, the environment that it's connected to. Organism and the organic consciousness of it, the formal organic consciousness of it, is always with the environment, with the Umwelt that it works with. So his account of consciousness stands very close to an ethological, an Uxquelian account of the environment. Not an already made product that contains subject and objects, but rather an affective field that produces both the subjects and the objects when the field itself is manipulated based on what has value for them. Consequently, Ruyer poses the question of how can an individual imitate anything in that field, anything that it perceives in its Umwelt. More than an issue of a mechanistic representation of the same, Ruyer's concern is a very valuable one for architecture. Beyond just copying and pasting, how do we perceive what we wish to imitate? What are the elements that we wish to bring into a space yet to come? And how does that selection/imitation chooses what has value for the individual performing it? To respond to that question, Ruyer will outline a profound isomorphism, a profound relationship between imitation and memory. The relation between imitation and memory, according to Ruyer, has four elements, has four crucial aspects. An individual imitates only what has meaning for it, in the same way that it memorizes, it remembers only what has meaning for it. In other words, an individual imitates and memorizes affects, affordances. The smiling face of a mother that provokes the smile in the child, as well as the memory of that smiling face even decades afterwards, is not an extensive mirroring, but an intensive, affective, and reciprocal informative moment, an informative synapse that's breaking space and time, transspatial, transtemporal, therefore. Second point, imitation folds spatial diversity and distance between the imitated and the imitator in the same way that memory folds the temporal diversity and distance between a primary experience and its recollection. Both imitation, that's his third point, both imitation and memory present to us an intensive difference between the threshold of recollection and recognition. In other words, we perceive the productive modulation of a threshold, and that's a Massumian understanding of affects, actually, and consequently imitate it right before we're able to invent it. So first we're able to imitate having perceived the meaning, the intensive meaning of something, and only afterwards we're able to invent it. Finally, memorization is an affective function that allows for the imitation of meaning. That's his most general claim. Whatever we are imitating or memorizing is meaning. That's the most general definition of memory and imitation that Ruyer can give. In their spatiotemporal folds, in their membranic folds, imitation and memory transduce affects and consequently intensify the synaptic moments that they are coming together. Through these fundamental capacities of secondary consciousness, of our brain's consciousness, the potential for both an imitation and also a memorization of form is actualized. Moreover, these capacities, and that's a crucial point for Ruyer, allow the imitation and the memorization of a virtual potential form that is not yet here in front of us. To put it in a very simple way, the more we get sensitive and used to imitate and memorize meaning, the more we become able to produce meaning ourselves, to introduce meaning ourselves. Therefore, next to a memory of the future also stands, and that would be a complementary note to Bergson, also stands a futural imitation. Ruyer does not hesitate to claim that this imitation presupposes a detour, a breaking of the transspatial region. Focusing on the reproduction of genes and viruses, in his own interpretation of the Sick of Theseus, Ruyer wonders how is it possible to determine which of the two copies of a gene, in the moment of it being reproduced, is the model and which one is the actual copy. The lack of individuality or the lack of a clearly assigned identity is, for both of the copies, a sign of the two mitigated individualities, their intimate connection with a transspatial type, something beyond them, something that, as Andrej was mentioning, could be seen as an idea, in quotes. In this sense, according to Ruyer, the issue of resemblance of either spatial or temporal membranic folds can only be addressed when we position it in a domain that escapes the present, that escapes the actual. In his words, the resemblance of two actualizations of a single memory require the idea of a mnemic theme. The organic resemblance of two individuals of the same species require the idea of a specific potential. By the same token, the resemblance of organs between two distant species, the resemblance of these organs to our tools, remember the stomach and the pot, indicates that all these similar actualizations are financed, are propelled by something else, something that is not situated in the right here, right now, in what he calls the transspatial region. This not right here, not right now, is nothing other than, as we mentioned before, the virtual, the pre-individual, a problematic field made of different relations and singularities. Yes. This transspatial region is none other than the virtual, a problematic field made of differential relations and singularities that are only later actualized by intensive processes of individuation, or more precisely in his own terms, by spatio-temporal dynamisms. It is a field populated with tensions, pregnant with incomplete potentials, and close to what Simondon was calling dephasing, which is the breaking of that field. Ruyer will claim that the transspatial region does not oppose the actual space in an abrupt way. There is a population of subregions that gradually move from the actual to the virtual and to the pre-individual transspatial. It's the region of actual consciousness, the region of individual psychological memories, the region of organic memories, and the region of norms and values. So for Ruyer, the question becomes, how can we move through these regions? How can we break the parallelism between them, when we consider them as separate domains? How can we move from the actual to the virtual back and forth in order to modulate and manipulate the present itself? Defined parallelism, breaking parallelism, is for Ruyer an exemplary characteristic of any intentional action, of any actualization of a directing essence, anything that happens with a purpose, a goal, and a final aim. Hence, if architectural thought wishes to grasp how there can be architectural intentions in the first place, it needs to ask, how can one design with a purpose in their own mind, with something, with an idea in their own mind? We should remember, however, that the interest for Ruyer does not lie in the individual alone, isolated and examined as a closed system, but the interest for Ruyer lies in how can we examine this breaking of parallelism in an open, metastable system where individuals of infinite forms and intensive affects are reticularly modulating each other as a system and themselves as individuals. Ruyer responds, therefore, by conceptualizing the cosmos as a fibrous universe, claiming that it has a fibrous structure in time, and each fiber represents this continuous life of individualized existence. The universe for Ruyer is membranic. It folds in space and time, and what is produced out of the folds is never separated by the membrane, by the whole itself, despite the fact that it allows the membrane to change, to differentiate, and accordingly also to rearrange the manner that the fibers come together. Every individuation is a fiber of the membrane, composing it and determining it while simultaneously being determined by it, since its very capacity to individuate relies on the membranic disjunction, on the coming together, that as a synapse brings knots, torsions, and folds together with one another. Individuation does not depend only on the fibrous folds of the membranes, but also any kind of emergence that comes out of the folds themselves depends on the existence of the whole, depends on the existence of the whole fibrous universe. Architecture, therefore, in the best case scenario, as the emergence of a novel line of individuation, depends on its inseparability from the membrane and on its capacity to intuit the directing essence of a fiber while disrupting its potential synaptic locations, the moments that it touches other lines. In addition to conceptualizing the cosmos as fibrous and membranic, Ruyer also asks us to understand matter as activity. Andrej also mentioned that. In this way, matter itself, matter as activity, becomes inseparable from time. They coincide with one another. Since time can no longer appear as an empty and foreign frame, the time of action is inherent to this action as temporal melody. If the fibrous lines of individuation that compose the cosmos, the activity of the vibrations and folds that generates a mnemic theme, there is actually a refrain, to use a Deleuzian term, there is a ritornello that pulsates through them, passes through them, and potentializes their future movement, as the formation again of synapses and as the indication of directing essences. Replacing therefore matter with activity is an essential move for Ruyer, since it's only when matter is understood as activity that his main concern can be addressed. How can we differentiate between absolute forms, an elephant in Andrej's previous example, and non-absolute forms, simple aggregates? This is the second conclusion that Ruyer comes with and is equally ingenious. Ruyer says that what is diagrammatically common to all individuals is a domain of absolute survey and activity. So any proper individual, any absolute form, has the capacity to survey itself and its activity. A molecule, an embryo, the brain, and our consciousness share all of those things, share the capacity to survey their own form and act purposefully in order to modulate it. However, since the guiding ideal or the purpose is simultaneously both the organic type, both the individual and the environment, both the survey and the modulation of its form need to be understood as a dynamic series of consequences that are their own consequence. Or, as Ruyer claims, and there he quotes Uxküll directly, every organism is a melody that sings itself. There is also a third conclusion that, and that's where I'm going to be finishing this lecture with, there is a third conclusion that Ruyer brings forward. Every individual can be examined as a form that can survey itself at an absolute speed and intentionally modulate itself and its milieu, its environment. So how can we approach this intention, this purpose, without undermining or overmining it, reducing it just to an aggregate of parts, mechanical parts, or reifying it, as phenomenology would do, in the version of an idealist ghost in a machine? To respond to that, Ruyer develops the concept of verticalism. So while an organism can be understood as a machine that builds itself, Ruyer also suggests that the organism, during its self-construction, it manages to function even at stages when it lacks the parts essential to the functioning of a completed machine, such as the human embryo, which manages to survive while also building the brain, heart, and lungs, without which it could not live once it's born. So one can easily document the development of an individual as a series of snapshots that capture the gradual growth, from the formation of a hand out of a limb and from the formation of a building out of the ground. One can very easily place a horizontal sequential line that, like snapshots, traces its formation. However, that would be beyond the point, that would not actually address the point of their production at all. Ruyer insists that we need to add a vertical dimension to our account if we are willing to be able to understand individuation as a goal-directed activity, an intentional modulation that coordinates all the different lines of continuity, all the different fibers of continuity under a unified task, and both a building as well as a hand, they're all unified tasks. They're not formed as an aggregation of parts, a collection of snapshots arranged horizontally. The first brick and the completed building, the merging lid and the infant's heart, are both the starting point and the end of a single and continuous line of development. They are parts of that melody. As Ronald Bogg, and Andrej mentioned him in his secondary literature, as he summarizes, sorry, I think I missed a quote that I would like to have here, but in any case, as Ronald Bogg says, and he summarizes, I don't know where this slide went, a melody unfolds in time, moment by moment, but the listener only knows fully that melody when it's completed, and only recognizes it as a genuine melody, as opposed to a random sequence of notes, when its overall design has been grasped, that design or shape being immanent with the melody from beginning to end. In a sense, the melody as shape exists outside of chronometric time, an idea that manifests itself moment by moment in its performance. So instead of grasping, and end of quote, that's my turn now, instead of grasping the melody as a horizontal sequence, so instead of seeing the development of a building or the hand as a horizontal sequence, instead of seeing them therefore as consecutive notes that one can represent one after the other, we need to think of it vertically. We need to think of it as the whole melody playing out. The first note folding upon the last note, chronos as our biological experience, folding upon the eon as the experience and the chronological unfolding of the cosmos itself. All notes manifested at any line of a performance, all expressed at any consecutive point of a horizontal timeline. In other words, when performed, the actual melody is nothing but a temporal unfolding of a fibrous melody idea. This is the verticalism of Ruyer, a melody idea that directs any intentional individuation. And nonetheless, this idea is not an idealism. It never loses contact with the spatio-temporal plane. It's produced of it, even though it's not constrained to actualize in space or in time. But at every moment, it expresses the totality of the structure which is able of constructing. So either in a hand or on the building, the melody that sings itself exists as a theme, a mnemic theme, a virtual form that becomes progressively actualized. In his neo-finalist account, all the individuals of the cosmos are actually centers of finalist action. They do not have a nature that is ready-made or given in advance, but they produce their own nature, according to an ideal that itself, the ideal, is open to re-evaluation. Between the actual individual and the virtual ideal, there is always a tension, and that's also what makes us keep on going. That's also what makes us going on living. As Ray Brassier would claim, one also of the original crew of the speculative realists, between the actual individual and the melody idea, between the actual and the virtual, There is always a tension where the actual distinguishes itself from its potentials without the potentials, without the virtual, distinguishing themselves from the actual. That's also what Ruyer has in mind when he claims that to grasp an idea, to grasp a value, means to work accordingly, to work according to that idea and to that value, and put all your best in order to actualize it in your own line of individuation and activity. To grasp a subject, to grasp an I, can only be achieved in the act of individuation, precisely because this act, individuating, enriches the I. And as I already spoiled it, this is what he calls make, and by making, make yourself. His premise of neo-finalism lies primarily in the definition that he gives for an individual. To be accurate, his definition of an individual lies in what Spinoza has qualified as the simplest possible individual, the simplest possible body that one can come across. And here I'm now using very quickly Daniel Smith in his very brief account of Spinoza's understanding of individuals. There are three different accounts of individuals. We're interested only in this last one. So there is the finite approach to individual that claims there is a lower material limit. So there is building blocks out of which anything is composed. There is the indefinite account that is the regression that Andrej showed before with the painter painting himself, which claims that matter can always be analyzed further without any limitation. It's an infinite regress. And then, as I mentioned, this last part, the actually infinite, insists that there are indeed terms that are ultimate, so there is finality, and these terms cannot be divided further, but these ultimate terms are actually infinite multiplicities. If we would wish to change them, if we would indeed put all our best to divide them and re-manipulate them further, then they would perhaps be open to that, but only with a fundamental change of their qualities, only with a fundamental change of their nature. Any individual, an absolute form is there for Ruyer, any individual understood as an assemblage, and the assemblage, therefore, as the minimum unit of reality. Anything is ultimate up to the point that it changes, and then it changes in nature. Any individual can be pregnant with the virtual, with potential, as a multiplicity that actualizes those potentials, acting as the building block that reshuffles the cosmos, reshuffles the universe, changing both its nature and its ideals. The manner in which an individual, as an assemblage, attempts to grasp its actual self and its virtual ideal is expressed in the ways that it modulates itself and its environment. The expressive aspect of individuation lies precisely in the technicities that an organism develops in order to possess itself, its ideals, as well as the environment that allow all of them to transform. So Ruyer will distinguish, and I'm closing soon enough, Ruyer will distinguish between three different types of technicities. What he calls bodily organs as an originary technicity, externalized organs as an extended phenotype, and detachable artifacts, that's the last one, the third one, that enter into a circuit external to the individual. So our hands, the web of a spider, and the house, the building in which all of them are individuating, are but different levels of technicities, corresponding to an organic formation, an extensive instinctive circuit, and an intelligent external circuit. What binds these lines of individuation together is not only their capacity to act and survey themselves, all of those, from hands to spiders to buildings, all of those act and survey themselves. They also have the capacity to express this act, to express this survey via these different levels of technicities. And also all these technicities, from a hand to a spider to a building, all of them, they are purposeful. In short, there is a finalist aim, there is a goal in mind when doing artifacts, like a building or a pot that we put on our gas, in the same way that there is a finalist purpose when a hand is developed. It's just not the finalist purpose of our brain's consciousness, or when a web of a spider is spun. Using the example again of cooking utensils, Ruyer would say that it's impossible to recognize a finalist sense of invention when one is designing a pot in their design tables, and not recognize it, or even worse, deny it, when it comes to the development of organs of ingestion, digestion, and assimilation. We should not prioritize neither of the two. We should just acknowledge that there is finalist aims and purposes in all sorts of individuations. Still, this third technicity has a decisive characteristic that distinguishes immediately from the other two. If bodily organs, like our hands, depend on a genetic memory and genetic imitation, and if the instinctive generalization of a spider's web depend on epigenetic memory and epigenetic imitation, then the intelligent generalization, which we can find in pots and buildings, depends on a very different kind of memory. And that's something that also Stigler made an emphasis on. This third type of memory is epiphylogenetic. It's the successive epigenetic experiences which are stored, accumulated, and transmitted from one generation and population of individuals to another in the form of technical objects. That's also where architecture is involved. That's also what we are doing. We are literally informing the future with meaningful imitations and meaningful memorizations. In addition to these three types and binding them, the passage of a mnemic theme through the transspatial and transtemporal region allows a stream of affective signs that cross throughout these domains, allow for an impersonal individuation, not an individuation of me, of you, of us, but of everything around us at once, that folds and unfolds all the rest through the synchronous act of their disparate virtual potentials. In the coming together of these three memories, and precisely because of it, there is a moment of radical transformation. The world, the cosmos, and all its technicities, while they might share the transspatial region as well as a transtemporal region, can be distinguished between individuals with less and more detachable memories. As he is claiming, the main difference between physical beings and the most complex organism does not derive from the instantaneity or the absence of memory in the former, but from the lack of detachment of this memory, which is only ever the form in time and does not constitute a transspatial reserve, clearly detached from the actual. In human beings, memory constitutes other I's that enrich the actual I. In this sense, Ruyer differentiates individuals according to the degree of detachment of their memory, as expressed in their technicities. So while, for example, atoms lack a detachable memory since they do not need it because of their constant activity, more complex individuals such as us use gradually detachable forms of memory. These three types of memory can also be examined, therefore, from the extent of their detachability, reaching its highest level, as far as we know till now, in human technicities. Genetic memory, epigenetic memory, and technological memory are just different steps of a progressive detachment. Due to this degree of detachment, human technicities become able to radically transform the relations of humans and their environment, and this is exactly where the reciprocity lies, in the generalization of the species and also in the concretization, in the perfecting of technical objects, as a detached memory that makes the human a living being characterized in its forms of life by the non-living. We're literally alive based on what is not alive. I'm finishing in any minute now. In other words, technicity, this last part of memory, epiphylogenetic memory, gives us, human individuals, access to the transspatial and to the transtemporal. And when I mean access, I mean literally direct access. You can see it in this picture of Pompeii. In that picture of Pompeii, there is a direct access via architecture to the transspatial and to the transtemporal. There is a direct access to a whole passage of a mnemic theme, to a whole melody that sings itself. The detachability of that memory, as expressed in a technicity, intensifies that melody. Artifacts, like those forsaken buildings in Pompeii, not only store memory, but they also function as propellers of synaptic passages, of synaptic locations, that assist both the invention of a novel technical individual, one that we are just about to invent, as well as the perfecting of a current technicity. These technicities, architectural ones included, have their own technological norms and values that form the synapses and the directing essences of a technological architectural line of individuation, which both invents itself and the human, us as well. Through technicities, our extended architectural minds, they can meet impersonal, imperishable, and detached architectural objects, as well as the norms and values of even times beyond their own. therefore breaking the parallelism, enacting what Andrej was calling the verticalism of the actual and the virtual, folding the fibers of the membranic cosmos by literally squeezing out of it an architecture that is not in front of us, not right here, right now, an architecture that's always yet to come, just about to come. In this reciprocity of an extended architectural mind, and a mind that is out there, and an architectural technicity that breaks the transspatial and the transtemporal, at this exact point, and there now I'm responding to the initial question, at this exact point, at this exact activity, an architectural consciousness emerges, which, like any kind of consciousness, has the capacity to act and to perform an absolute survey of its domain, of itself, has the capacity to make itself by simply making, memorizing, and imitating its future form. What's astonishing in the evolution of technicities is that they present indeed this absolute verticalism. So while biological evolution, as we've seen in the hand, for example, manifests this verticality in a long duration and in where different types of memory come together, in a technological evolution, with different emerging architectural styles or techniques of production, with forgotten practices of the past or even current avant-garde parametricism or AI techniques, with computer-aided design as well as Gothic churches, all of them are immediately synaptically attached to one another. All of them highlight the rapid individuations of architectural technicities. Nevertheless, and this is my last line, it's crucial not only to realize the extent to which technicities operate autonomously in this immediate coming together, evolving in their own distinctive manner, but it's also crucial to understand their dissimilarity for biological evolution. So this absolute verticalism, this absolute wrapping together of the melody in technical evolution, if we compare it to the relatively slower verticalism of biological evolution, consists in the fact that technical objects, they're artifacts of detachable memory, and by being so, they have the capacity to operate at an absolute speed. What do I mean by that is that if a synapse, if the moment that something comes together, if the moment that there is a passage for something to pass by, is a speed regulator, you can imagine that there is a flow of something. The bigger that the synapse is, the slower the flow, the more close the synapse being, the more intense the flow. So if synapses are speed regulators, then technical objects are actually their perfect match. Technical objects are extreme membranic densities, they're extreme singularities of convergence. In all of them, all different kinds of memory, all different types of memory come together and assist the potential of a passage of a mnemic theme that no constraint literally can regulate. On the contrary, technical individuals assist in the resolution of all the tensions between all different levels of constraints. Their absolute verticalism entails therefore a drastic shift. If the melody of architecture can be sung in any key and still make sense, and when I say that, I'm very literal, if the melody of architecture can be sung in Gothic or parametricist keys and still make sense, if the start and the end of architecture continuously coincide, Pompeii and a high-end building, then technical individuals are not just what allows us to break the parallelism between the actual and the virtual. They're actually what allows us to become the future that we do not yet see, the purpose that we do not yet know, and the intention that we do not yet have. Technical individuals, architecture, is always from the future, even when we discover it in archaeological excavations. It's always from a future that is beyond our chronological time. And there I'm going to leave it. My apologies for tiring you off.
Don't apologize. Well, don't apologize at all. That was terrific. I really gotta. I mean, I introduced Andrej as being the winner of our Mark Cousins Award last year, and sadly, of course, he passed away a couple of years ago. But both of you kind of somehow seem to be maintaining the spirit, I think, of what Mark was all about. I mean, he was like setting a level of debate when he was at the AA that we rarely see elsewhere in architecture. I think we could see glimpses of that of course, in Sanford's work and Mammon Delander, although Delander is unfortunately now retired to Mexico. So maybe now we're seeing a shift in terms of the center of debates to Delft stroke Brussels stroke wherever it is. So I wanted to just ask a question, but at the same time, before I ask that question, I just want to just invite those in the audience to themselves ask questions, and both in the Zoom audience, but also those on YouTube. And please, if you could send it in on the chat, then we can begin to address it. I'm not quite sure how much time we have, but certainly I think this has been so useful in terms of kind of just laying out there in a very, very intense but explicit and super clear way the contribution of a thinker that I think needs to be engaged with and has a future as well. I think the question of the past and the future was an interesting one that I want to just touch on now. One of the things I wanted to really, in some sense, question was the notion of architecture as an end product. That was a term that was used early on, at least. I think Stavros were using that term. I just wanted to say that, but from my perspective, and I'm sitting here in Miami, right, in the sense that we are only too acutely aware of a kind of a continuum, in the sense that I guess the word that I didn't hear, which I'm sure was behind all this, it was the word ecology, and certainly Guattari, of course, picks up on the word of ecologies, and that is really something that is so present in our world today, especially in the architecture of a place like Miami, where people are still building, and yet we know that in a few years' time we will be going underwater and God knows what else. So we have to see this in a broader spectrum of how things are going to go. And it strikes me that kind of, and we live in some senses in a culture which both in terms of the past has what Andreas Huyssen describes as a form of amnesia. It's kind of the instantaneous present in which we operate. We really don't pay attention to the past, but equally, in some senses, we don't pay attention to the future. I think there's a kind of I don't know what the word would be, but a kind of a future amnesia or something that needs to be engaged with. And it struck me that one of the things I've always thought about the question about the present is that on the one hand, the present doesn't technically exist because we have the past and we have the future. And it is that kind of finite, that flash of passage between the past and the present. So only for that instantaneous fraction of a second, even no time at all, does the present exist. In other words, at one level, we could start asking whether or not we could even use the word form in terms of architecture as a kind of notion, in the sense that we are in a continuous melody or something else. At the same time, you know, I'm conscious of Zizek's, I mean, the most beautiful description of dialectic I keep mentioning, but I'll repeat again just for the sake, because I think it's an amazing one, is the distinction between the photograph and the movie. You know, Zizek makes this comment that we seem to think they're completely different. The photograph is a frozen moment of time, and the movie being this kind of continuum, this animated continuum, but actually they're dialectically connected, because what is a photograph but a kind of a snapshot, a frozen moment from that animated continuum, and what is what is a movie but a series of those snapshots literally threaded together. That's what a movie reel is all about. So on the one hand, we could sort of say that on the one hand, that form doesn't actually exist as such. At the same time, we could almost say the opposite, in the sense that what we're seeing is actually an aggregation of those moments. What we see in that kind of continuum, in that melody and whatever else is that kind of thing, which is that the overload almost of these things, which in some sense is, so you can see both sides of the coin, both the kind of the triple O kind of thing, where we all just look at the object, which is an approach I really have problems with. And also you could see the kind of process-based thinking that's behind all this. But it struck me that in some senses, though, the real problem is, or at least maybe if I were to challenge anything, I would challenge the notion of the building as an end product. And it struck me that that image of Pompeii wasn't long forgotten buildings. It was something, the buildings were now part of a kind of afterlife in some sense, or whatever you might call it, where they're now being appropriated as a kind of a touristic spectacle in some senses. but they're living on. So in other words, the building doesn't finish when it's been produced. It's when the kind of the spiders come in and make their spiders webs. And I think this is really a problem that we have in architecture of thinking that is it. The building is the final end product, but really it's just a kind of, there is the future, and we need to think about that. I mean, I'm so familiar with these kind of wonderful, these photographs. You find them in journals, where before people come in and mess things up, there's a photograph of the building in ideal state before people start, putting their rubbish and their furniture everywhere and making a mess of it. But actually, that is it. That is it. The event space is really what we're talking about. So let me just throw that out there as a comment. I mean, can we even use the term end product in terms of architecture?
You want to go, Andrej?
Do you need to catch breath?
You go ahead. You go ahead first, and I contribute in a bit. Yeah.
Yes, I think I have a few things I have to immediately say. I totally agree with you with this idea that the present, is a cutting edge that somehow it's a wedge between the past and the future doesn't exist. And here I find very helpful this figure provided by William James, who says that the present should be seen in terms of like a saddle. So you are perched in a saddle, and you're able to observe far ahead and far behind, which of course immediately brings to mind another figure, the famous Bergsonian cone, which is to say that the past, the present coexists, or it's co-temporal with the whole of past, even including the past that's never been present. So we have to make it more complicated. But when it comes to the idea of end product, here I want to draw on, to my mind, still the best way of approaching it would be the metalogue of Gregory Bateson. I believe that one of these sessions will be devoted to his work. This metalogue where he says in a quasi-infantile way, asking, do things have outlines? That would be another way of putting it, like where do they end? And then he keeps asking these questions, building upon questions, and you realize that eventually the answer is they both do and do not have outlines. I think that's the same way that you were trying to make the dialectics between the image, the snapshot, and the movie. And I think Deleuze, in one of his Vincennes lectures, he says, so what would be the end product? How do you, where does the forest end? And he says, is it, do you come to the edge of the forest? But we all know that it's way before we come to the what we consider to be the last tree that marks the forest, that the forest already thins out. So he concludes that it's not the shape of the forest, it's the how far its action reaches. And that's, of course, is always relational. It's ecological through and through, because it was also the question on ecology. And by the way, of course, when we say ecology, immediately cannot but reduce it to greenwashing, to the concerns of the environment. It is immediately related to the mental ecology, that is to say, the concept making, the socials, the collective, and the environment itself. And I think Stavros has very successfspecially brought them together in this fibrous Ruyerian universe. That is, again, I want to transspatial, transtemporal, and it does indeed have a capacity of bringing all these things together, which makes any and every discourse that, and we've been exposed to those, especially at the turn of the century, the end of this, the end of that. There's never, never will be ever end to the. It's always about, let's say, what Stavros was also hinting at, this idea of unlimited finity, the fact that things can be rearranged and to produce new capacity, yet untapped potentials. So it goes on and continues. As a matter of fact, we have decided that for the next, we will do Juarero for our seminar because she is questioning this idea of reducing all the braided causality to just efficient causality to energetics or thermodynamics. She says we have to, this is not what she says, but how I read it. She says it's high time for us to consider also incorporeal causalities, namely what would in Aristotelian language be the final and the formal cause. But then we also realized that recently Simondon's book on images and imagination and invention, what is it called? Imagination in the...
Imagination and invention, yeah.
Invention also provides incredible resources for thinking also this idea of how we can never... The end is the new beginning, and then you have the kind of ratcheting mechanism where you have the movement that produces perception, the perception that produces concepts build into a new inventions or object that in turn become now a starting point for yet another spin of this kind of memory of the future. But Stavros, now I bring...
No, it's, I mean, building upon what Andrej was mentioning and trying in that sense also to respond to what Neil put forward as an issue, namely the issue of very broadly, let's call it time and how time is approached. Because also whether you conceptualize a building as an end product or not is also in its own right a question of time. I mean, supposedly you put a certain, in the bad sense of the term, finality on something, and then you say that's the end product, or at least the end product of a certain activity and the beginning step of another activity. I'm very much aware, and it's funny enough, I mean, from Wednesday we start teaching a course, Michael is also going to be there, but we usually address that. There is this, as you said, past, present, future, PPF, we call it, this PPF approach to time, past, present, future, which while helpful for communicative purposes, so we can say past, we mean yesterday, we can say present, we mean right now we're discussing. We can say future, we mean next week we're going to be traveling there. So communicative purposes, that works fine. And it's an agreement we have all agreed upon. In that sense, it's a norm that has its own values in its own right. But if we are to approach it from a much more ontological perspective, indeed, there's no such thing as past or future. There's a continuously unfolding experience, which is what we can call the present. Very interestingly, Ruyer and Simondon are related with one another in that issue. They both, from very, complementary yet slightly different perspectives, approach it in a very unexpected way. They approach time from terms that we usually associate with space. So they approach time with terms of interiority and exteriority. So they both claim that indeed, ontologically, there's only experience, okay? Activity and its experience, no past or future. In activity and its experience, there is moments that activity and experience are interiorized. So when you feel like you own something, when something affects you deeply, that's an instance of an interiorized experience, okay? And then there is also moments, for example, literally, that would be a bus heading onto you and killing you, where experience is coming from the outside, is coming from the exterior. That's what they also associate with what we colloquially call the future. In the discussion of time from the perspective of the interior and the exterior, they basically qualify to experience interiorized, that we are keeping with us slowly in our development as individuals, each one of us, and experience exteriorized, that we are either sensitive to it, insensitive to it, or, and that's for me the interesting point architecturally, or technologically enhanced to be sensitive to it or not. So for me, the question of architecture, end product or not end product, we can leave that out for a moment, is whether as a technological enhancement can allow the, let's call it again, it's an abstraction, the designer to technologically enhance themselves to be sensitive to experience that it's outside of them, and subsequently to allow also for, again, an abstraction, the users to be sensitive to experience outside of them. So as a very concise response, for me, the question indeed should not be about architectural buildings as end products, but rather as technological enhancements of sensitivity for both the one making them and the ones experiencing them afterwards. The point with Pompeii, as far as I'm concerned, the point with Pompeii is that as a technological enhancement of sensitivity that has almost 2,500 years on its back, what it's able to do, and in more or less degrees, you can find it in all buildings, in all architectural, let's say, artifacts, it's still able to technologically enhance us nowadays in order to open up our sensitivities to something. And this opening up of sensitivity, which is a continuous process for each one of us, is actually a process of a continuous meaning infusion. We're continuously infusing our lives and the lives of others around us with meaning, with purpose, with goals, with aims. And that's where I finished the lecture. This continuous infusing of meaning, purpose, aim is actually the thing that produces, now it's going to sound very pompous what I'm saying, but it's actually the thing that produces time itself. So the colloquial understanding of time as PPF, past, present, and future, is only possible because of all of us being able to see all the previous artifacts that other individuals, other beings in the past, what we colloquially call the past, managed to do. Because we see purpose, and in seeing purpose, we realize that there was a consequence of action. We realize that there was an intention behind them. And that gives us also an understanding of our sequence of actions, our understanding of our intentions. Architecture produces time. That's the claim that one could make following that argument.
Elizabeth Gross actually touches on this. She says that due to her understanding of primary consciousness, because everything is suffused by primary consciousness, is that we can be energized by somebody else's ideas, because it's made of this, the movement that is catalyzing.
I don't want to say dwell on this, but surely there's a risk there of giving architecture an agency, and it is us that find meaning in it. Ultimately, it's continually coming from us, and I really think that was a beautiful part of what you're talking about there, Stavros, is this idea of connecting memory and meaning, and I think that's super interesting as an insight. There's some questions in the chat now. I don't want to hog this at all, but I'm just trying to see what we got. I can see there's definitely a question there from Vasco, who is here in the Zoom link. With Vasco, we always have a problem with these noise in the background because he's in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and I don't know if you want me to read this out for you, Vasco. It's actually you can see it in the chat anyway, but everyone, but. I'm assuming that I should read it out then. So just picking up on this, Ruyer's ideas challenge conventional distinctions between nature and technology, suggesting that the built environment is an extension of natural processes. How does he conceptualize the technological unconscious in relation to architecture? And what ethical considerations does this raise for contemporary architectural practice? Shall I read that out again, or did you get that?
Yeah. The thing is that shall I, Andrej, or not?
Please go, please.
The thing is, and again, it's just out of the top of my head. The thing is that for Ruyer, there would not be such thing as unconscious to begin with. Precisely for the same reasons that there is no such thing as only human or only animal consciousness. Ruyer claims basically that everything that is active is conscious, because activity is the foundation of consciousness, not the other way around. So in his understanding between proper individuals, let's say, which is not human individuals or animal individuals, and aggregates, he would say that aggregates basically are just bunches of activities that in their coming together are not able to produce a way of surveying themselves, of being able to, not consciously in our brain's consciousness, know what they're doing, but sense the semblance of their own form in what they're doing. This might sound panpsychist, and perhaps it is a bit panpsychist, and I don't have particularly any problem with that. On the other hand, it should not be neither reduced to a kind of a technological reductionism as well, in that sense, going and saying that, therefore everything has a soul around us. Precisely the question for Ruyer is debunking the soul from a perspective which eventually creates something more than the soul. So it's not taking the soul out of things and replacing it with another term, is actually realizing that the soul is much more profound and much more able than what we colloquially assign it to when it comes to either human individuals or when we do it metaphorically for technological individuals. So I would respond to that in terms of technological unconscious in that way, and I would basically prompt anyone. Vasco seems interested in that question. I would prompt Vasco, if you were to take Ruyer seriously, to figure out which are these lines of activity that come together, produce certain, let's say, assemblages, and in which kind of consciousnesses one could focus on in those assemblages?
I'll just add the only way I could actually perhaps a Guattarian line would be applicable here. When Deleuze and Guattari, they obviously are very critical of mechanicism, and they replace it with the idea of the machinic understanding, and especially, I mean, Guattari uses the term machinic unconscious, so that could come close to the fibrous universe, insofar that it's indeed, as Stavros claims, then if we take very seriously the idea of the primacy of activity, because what is it that they mean by machinism? But Bernard Cash, he actually says it. We shouldn't say machinism; we should say mechanism. It's actually it's the connections, its liaisons come first. It's the idea that the book is not about the world. It's a machine that couples with the world so as to produce rather than reflect. It is this idea of Barad again with interaction, where you intervene, meeting the universe halfway. You're intervening into the causal fabric so as to produce an effect. Nothing is given, everything is produced, and therefore, perhaps in this way, I could relate it to the non-anthropomorphic machinic unconscious, or this in Guattarian terms.
Maybe I could bring in Mitra, who also has a question in the chat. Mitra, do you want to ask your question? Mitra is in Iran, I believe.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for a comprehensive and amazing lecture. Actually, my question is about some researchers believe that consciousness is generated by interaction or interoperations of various parts of our brain, and some further believe that constructing a system such as a machine that can emulate or simulate this interaction would result in a conscious system. Or it could be, as far as I remember, it would be a kind of neural correlation. So on the other hand, as far as I know, a computer cannot have a unitary sense experience or causal structure and eventually consciousness. So could AI become conscious? If yes, how close is AI to consciousness?
You want to go, Andrej?
Yes, this is where I follow Masumi, who really wants us to take seriously the distinction between interaction. So that means putting into communication already fully constituted elements, be they subjects or objects, or something, and something that which is very different from relation. Relation is something that Karen Barad is trying to get at with this neologism of interaction, the relation that pre-exists or precedes or is antecedent to its terms, its relata. So I think when Ruyer is talking about the fibrous universe, he's turning it around so as to put the relations and activities first, which are then capable of engendering the relata. So and this in Barad it's called agential realism. So again a primacy of activity before. So to me this idea of correlation is belongs to the philosophy of access, because you correlate something with something, but that something and something else, or as it were, need to pre-exist. And I with the Ruyer's hat on, I want to actually say that this really doesn't get at the nature of the fibrous universe, where relation is primary, where activity is. And it's very difficult to wrap one's head around it, because we are so used to, thinking in terms of what Manning calls we chunk the world with such ease and so effortlessly that it's very difficult. Even our language actually makes us biased, the way it's structured, subject, predicates, and so on. So we always think in terms of already fully constituted things, and then as it were, connect to produce an effect. I think so. I would so to continue in that sense. It would be very difficult for me to understand how would we gauge, what would be the, you said the moment of singularity when the machines become intelligent and conscious. I'm not sure how to.
There is it's not that this is a very well thought out response that I'm going to give now, but it's continuing from where Andrej is leaving it. There is a very interesting text that for me is one of the go-to texts when it comes to AI, and also partially from an architectural perspective as well. There is a very interesting thinker called Matteo Paschinelli, and Matteo Paschinelli has written a very short but very interesting paper a few years ago called "Machines that Morph Logic." And it's mostly providing quite a lot of background information into how what we can now call AI, but in more broad terms, what we can call, let's say, generalized artificial intelligence, is and could be read through the lenses of the three distinct forms of logics, which is induction, deduction, and the last part, which is abduction. According to him, even the most advanced machines that we have capable have only been able to perform a weak form of abduction, what is being called a statistical abduction. So, for example, if you have a dozen of eggs and you see the first 3 eggs are rotten, then you assume, you abduce, you speculate that all the eggs probably are rotten. This is a statistical abduction. A strong abduction is what living individuals can do. Is what also in other terms Simondon was calling transduction. It's a very similar term. It's also what in other terms Ruyer was calling with his more eloquent phrasing of breaking the parallelism. So Ruyer's verticalism is a moment of strong abduction, is a moment of transduction, is a moment where from one domain you take literally a risk, a leap of faith, and you find structural meaning that can structure you in another domain. That could be as simple as listening for the first time to the sound of something and figuring out speculatively whether this is something dangerous or not for you and modulating your action accordingly. Why do living individuals, from the simplest to the most complex forms, why can they do that? Why can they transduce? It sounds very stupid, but they can do that because they can die. There is literally a skin in the game that pushes individuals, living individuals, to take that speculative risk, that leap of faith, where they seek abductively, they speculate for a meaning in something that is not in front of them. So to respond in one word, I think that for AI to be conscious and or alive, it would need first to be able to die. And that brings us to a paradox. As you can realize, to a logical paradox. If for something to need to be alive, then it needs to first be able to die. It puts us in a dead end as to how this could potentially be alive and or conscious.
So from finalism to finity.
To finity, and the one response that I could give in a less, let's say, in a less short way, but I'm not going to go to the full extent of it now, would be that perhaps it could be conscious, but not as we imagine it to be, or what we could call consciousness. So it could be conscious, but conscious in the sense, it might already even be conscious in the sense of surveying its own activity, but that would not be perhaps a consciousness that we humans can recognize and relate to. The animalistic human consciousness that we can relate to is a consciousness that always implies death inside it. And that's something that it's death is radically different for a machine, quote unquote, on the machine.
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree with that, Stavros. And I think that whenever we're using these terms in the field of the mechanical, we have to use inverted commas, intelligence inverted commas.
Yeah.
Learning inverted commas, thinking inverted commas, and certainly this area. I mean, there is a huge debate going on out there, and I won't go into it, but Max Tegmark, Yuval Harari, and others all talking about this kind of question, whether indeed machines need to be useful. Anil Seth as well. This is not saying that it's not a product of intelligence, consciousness. But I strongly sense that what we're talking about in its debate today is not the consciousness. It's a different kind of consciousness, the way the discourse of consciousness we're talking about normally. It's almost like some background horizon rather than kind of the entity that's become the subject of consciousness and so on. That was my perception, but
also we assume it in a way, but it's always a separatist kind of way, you know. I mean, we assume it in a kind of a closed system kind of way, where supposedly even many times, unfortunately, from this sort of generic sciences that we are very much attuned to. When I say generic, I mean sciences that are basically sciences of the quantitative, hard sciences, like not all, but many parts of physics or many parts of mathematics even. And we think in closed laboratory terms. So we speak of consciousness or human consciousness, and we think of it in a very isolated manner, in a very separatist manner. We do not really realize the very, very serious implications that, for example, the movement of the planet as a planetary system, as a planetary body, has in the development of our supposed consciousness. So, in very few words, we cannot separate our consciousness from the movement of the planet and from the rotation of the planet around the sun and the rotation around of the sun in the Milky Way. In that same way, if we don't...
And the atoms within us.
And the atoms and everything. So in that same way, I don't see why we should think of machinic consciousness as something that would stand as separate to our own. We could be fundamental blocks in the development of a different kind of consciousness. That could be a machinic AI, or call it whatever you want, consciousness. But that would not stand next to us. Or perhaps in some cases, it might not be even feasible without us and our contribution, continuous work and activity and contribution into it. The same way that our consciousness, if this planet stops rotating, is going to go literally in the ends of space and disappear within seconds. So I would not be a proponent of this separatist understanding of consciousness, where consciousness is separated from literally all the fibers that work hard to attain it.
And continuously change. You were attempting this. I mean, at the slide where you distinguish between the three. You remember the finity. That last one was in my.
The actually infinite. It was called, yeah.
The last
it's the finite individual, the indefinite individual, and the actually infinite. Yes.
I'm just conscious of time, and I'm just looking through to see what we get in terms of order. I mean, I'm jumping through. There are a lot of compliments here in the chat. Thank you for this incredible discussion. And I'm not quite sure where the first question comes in. Certainly, hold on a second. I'm just jumping through. So Ranpan has a comment, I think. Maybe. Shall I just read it out? I guess it is indeed connected to the ethical considerations, given the experiences largely multiplicities. To understand, one needs first to firstly feel, ? This is my take.
Yeah.
The answer is yes. Okay. Okay, Marcelo, maybe you're here. Do you want to make your comment or not, or should I just read it out again? Yeah, let me read it out. Okay, thank you for this deep journey. Not asking, but just reflecting. This theory delves into a very tight, almost unexplored space between philosophy and biology, reframing traditional consciousness almost as a redundant, in brackets, surveyed act, therefore upgrading it into a more primal and instinctive act. Thank you all. I think that's a fair take on that. There's a question here from Gustavo. Do you want to ask your question quickly? I'm just wondering how we fit all these things in. Gustavo, do you want to?
Well, thank you very much. It was a whirlwind moment. I think my question, or maybe it can just be a comment. I'm really a lot of the metaphors that you used, I think, are also shifting and moving in definition. So when I was thinking about time, and I think, Stavros, you talked about us always being in movement or in action. And I thought that was interesting, I think, placement. How do you see the kind of this evolution of science now and how it's defining or redefining the biological? How does that work with this type of framework of consciousness? Because there is, we have a quantum consciousness program here at UC Santa Barbara, and they're looking at that edge, and you brought up the idea of quantum. How do you frame that in this, I guess, in this thinker or philosophy?
Before I give the room to Andrej to respond, I'm gonna respond with a phrase which is one of my favorite phrases. It might seem not connected. It's one of my favorite phrases, and it comes from Bergson, from his one of his most misunderstood books, which is The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. This is the title of the books. And he finishes the book by saying that the universe is a machine for the making of gods. And I find it literally, this is one of the most beautiful phrases ever written. The universe is a machine for the making of gods. If you take Bergson seriously into that and trying to respond to what you're saying, I think what most contemporary aspects and efforts when it comes to things that we can call technological, let's say, cutting edge aspirations, are lacking precisely this last part, the making of gods, which for me is where philosophy should be coming in. The making of gods, Bergson has in mind the production of value. In words that Andrej used before. This production of value is something that cannot not be philosophical, not in the sense of a discourse of philosophy, but philosophical in the sense of speculating about why something would be of value, why something would be of value as opposed to something else, why something would be worth this as opposed to something else. If this is lacking, if this making of God's parts is lacking, then eventually I think that many of the other technological efforts are also lacking something besides a mere fascination with their capacity to be actually feasible. I think we are at a point, let's say, especially due to the fragmentation of knowledge, that is one important aspect of it is the modern academia and the way that it operates. Due to the heavy fragmentation of knowledge, leading to what Stigler was calling a proletarization of knowledge, everyone becomes an expert of their own extremely niche expert field. We are lacking this thorough, transdisciplinary, necessary reevaluation of what kind of gods are we making in this machinic cosmos of ours.
Stavros, can I just maybe pick up on that? I mean, to my mind, it's precisely that question: what are we making? What gods are we making? Because certainly, if you take Delander's view, the universe is kind of Brownian motion. It doesn't have any meaning behind it, but we are the ones who produce. We are the meaning-making machines, and it seems to me that religion is very much a product of that urge. But that's my particular viewpoint. I don't want to distract the discussion.
No, I agree with you.
Maybe I can just, to tie together this idea of the necessity of trespassing the transdisciplinarity. And it seems to me that architecture is very well positioned precisely because, to use, I did say that perhaps the deepest, the most profound engagement with Ruyer comes in what is philosophy chapter on the brain, including chapter where Deleuze and Guattari distinguish between the three ways of dealing with chaosmosis, with chaos, and they say that like sciences, the arts, and philosophy, they all are, you could see them as in terms of like a sieve that try to somehow let's say deal with the problem of chaos, albeit in very different ways. And I think I'm very enthusiastic about the capacity of architecture not to be pigeonholed in either of the three, and yet kind of promiscuously shifting and moving between. We are all scientific sufficiently, we are philosophical sufficiently, and clearly we are into aesthetics and arts. And they distinguish, and I think it's nice the way they put it. They say that sensation is about contraction. It happens unwittingly. You just contract as a flower would the sun, the energy, the minerals from the ground, the water, and so on. It's contraction, about building this habit. But then it produces something that they call an inject. Then they say philosophy produces concepts. and it produces the brain produces a superject, and they use this neologism by Whitehead. So not subject, not something that comes from below as the ground of thinking, but something that is super. It just on something that is emerges. So it's superject, and then when it comes to sciences, they say it deals with functions, something that needs to be repeated in laboratory conditions. So it produces an eject, a partial observer, and I think I like this move because it never it's very ecological insofar that it does not reduce this complexity, and it gives justice to different styles of engagement with the chaos, and as I said, instead of thinking it as three separate autonomous engagements, I think architectures, we are lucky to be in the discipline that cannot but trespass all the time and engage with the three ways of dealing with the chaos, with the fibrous universe. So I recommend, I think one way of getting a foot in the foothold in Ruyer's thinking is through what is philosophy, and especially that chapter on the brain.
We're running a little bit short of time, but I'm anxious to try and get those who've made comments on the chat to kind of to make this to offer them. Cletus, was it? Did I pronounce that correctly? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Well, I thank you very much for all of this. One of the things that kind of grabbed my attention is just the many different ways that the notion of something that is happening in sequence but is one thing, or Zizek's description of the photograph in the film is certainly one that's always been close to me. And I feel like both the notion of, is something even bounded by its own outline in many different ways. We're kind of taking received concepts and trying to say, but isn't there a dynamic relationship? Mm-hmm. And I would just add to that I also feel like within this, either the paradoxical or in some ways, like, what are we missing? And I posted in the comment, but it made me think of Brunelleschi's demonstration of perspective in the plaza in Florence, where not only did he make a perspectival image of a building, but actually the viewer of the image had to hide behind it and peer through it at a mirror that was also reflecting the sky. And all of those things, that notion that as we're talking about the subject, is there something also about our subject position and perception where consciousness might also involve a hiding behind the consciousness? This dilemma of what is shown is also what is blocking out the world is something that I wonder if you have thoughts on.
You want to go now first, Andrej?
It's a great example. I'm thinking, what constitutes this post-Darwinian theory of sensibility would be to say that it is the sensibility that itself involves. And here I'm thinking about this reversal of the reversed ontology, where if we really, I was earlier arguing for the necessity of where the relation comes first, this idea that it produces its relata. So if the point of view comes first, it then creates, then the subject itself, the I or the consciousness becomes the secondary. So I think with an invention of a linear perspective, we literally rewire the brain in synaptic terms that Stavros was resynchronization of the brain occurs through the production of a different point of view, literally. So that could be like the perspective of Brunelleschi. It could be Cézanne. Somebody said we would never ever be able to look at Saint-Victoire in real life after we've seen Cézanne's paintings. And then these things are machines that they have the capacity of rewiring the brain and modulating our sensorium, and perhaps by sentience and sapience in one go. So they're machines. As I said, the value is produced like shampoo and cars. So is the point of view, and therefore the sensibility, which in turn just allows us to perhaps develop. We will be soon dealing with this. Becomes a booster of our capacity to intuit and have what Whitehead calls develop our prehensive capacity. But Stavros, I bring it past.
No, I'm not going to open this small box because it's a very deep box. And but very briefly, I recommend a book by I think I've recommended it, or we recommended it in all the previous two sessions as well. There is a book by, I don't know if you're coming from the States, so I can say a compatriot of yours. You sounded like you were coming from the States, but if you're coming from the States, then a compatriot of yours, which surprisingly has not used none of the people we've mentioned, like Simondon or Deleuze or Ruyer even, by the name Terence Deacon. He has a book called The Incomplete Nature. And besides the details of the book, which are very rich and very interesting in their own right, one of the main claims that Deacon is putting forward, the subtitle of the book is How the Mind Emerged from Matter. So one of the main points he's trying to make is that we always fall into the same mistake of trying to understand how we are produced ourselves as humans by the final, I mean, I don't want to say end product as I did for architecture and Neil opposed, but in any case, but what we can call a final end product, which is our current bodies and minds. We're always trying to reverse engineer our production, okay? Deacon is proposing that we go the other way around, that we start from literally specks of dust that is everywhere around us and try to figure out how the hell could specks of dust come to organize themselves in a way that eventually, through many jumps, leads to what we are right here, right now. In that sense, I would say that your question on the perspectives and how all these different perspectives might focus on or hide aspects of quote-unquote consciousness, I wouldn't call it, I mean, don't take me wrong, I wouldn't call it a mistaken question, but I would call it a question that assumes that there is a finalized or perfected state of consciousness that we're just either choosing to expose or hide. While Deacon would say that there's no such thing. We are still under production. And the question would be not to take us as end products, but rather figure out from the matter around us how such a thing like us could ever be produced. He has a very interesting response, and that's probably the topic of another whole session, his response. But I think even to that question on Brunelleschian's perspectives, Deacon's approach, which is basically an approach on dynamisms, different levels of material organization that introduces new dynamisms, it could also give you a very insightful approach onto dealing with particular discussions on artistic forms of perspectival annotations.
I think you touched on it with reference to Spinoza's conatus, no? And I think maybe Gökhan will be touching on this as well.
Yeah, we've got one more question. Let me just simply say, because thank you for that question. It's a great question. Tuesday I think it's the 27th, and Tuesday week, it's not on a Sunday. We have Andy Clark coming, who will very close to the work of Anil Seth, who works on consciousness, and it's about predictive perception, which links in very closely with what was debated today about forwarding backwards. I think it's going to be a fantastic session based on his recent book. I would also say that I mentioned in passing Max Tegmark, who comments on these things and talking about actually what comes to our consciousness is actually being filtered in some sense. There's other things that are going on beneath that never enter our kind of our conscious horizon. So there's a Stavros said, it's a Pandora's box. That's a huge subject, but I think a fantastic question. I want to just finish off by asking Mikhail, who is in China now, I think, to ask his question. Great to see you, Mikhail.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Stavros and Andrej. This was wonderful and brilliant. Yeah, we're approaching 2 a.m. here in Hong Kong, so I'll keep it brief for my own sake, but even more so for yours. Okay, so where do I begin? I also thought about artificial intelligence through, let's say, a Ruyerian lens, perhaps. And I meant to bring up a recent paper by Leanne Gabora and Joscha Bach. Joscha Bach was also on here, but this was before my time. He's a brilliant computer scientist and kind of unconventional, very interesting. And this paper is called A Path to Generative Artificial Selves. They argue that creativity should be assessed in terms of internal self-transformation, which requires a self, a bounded, self-organizing, self-preserving agent that is distinct from and interacts with its environment. I suppose the notion of the self and Ruyer is also interesting, but maybe that's a separate a topic. So, briefly, what they're proposing is what they call reflexively autocatalytic networks. So I think this notion of the autocatalytic is also very interesting. And not to get into it, but just suffice to say that what it means is that the whole can be reconstituted through interactions among the parts. This is a major difference from basically all existing models that we currently have, even the most advanced ones. And it made me also think about this comment of Elizabeth Gross on Ruyer, who said that maybe this capacity of the embryo to heal, she says, heal without external intervention, underpins all of Ruyer's work. I find this also very interesting in terms of thinking about regeneration and let's say healing. Now, basically I'm not sure if this is actually a question or more so like a comment, but they conclude by saying that, as I said, existing models, regardless of how advanced they are, their creativity is not driven by their own intrinsic desire to explore, understand, etc. And maybe we can call this is now me saying this curiosity, at least I do so in my own research framework. So I think maybe this connects to our earlier discussion on AI. And I was just wondering if you had sort of any thoughts about this in terms of can we, let's say, in a sense, think AI through Ruyer or vice versa, right? Think Ruyer through AI. So I'll conclude with that, and thank you very much. I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Oh, in one point, I did refer to, it's a very Massumian way of style of speaking about the convivial appetition. By that, I meant that in this this, I also did refer to Nancy's idea of being singular, plural, and the colonial nature of the subject itself. So I think when Yolanda says we are literally of the stars, we are the stardust. It means that whatever we consider to be, like anything and anything that goes on is already a resolution or disparity of myriad of different activities at various levels. So I think. In that sense, I mean, I keep coming back to this very evocative idea of fibrous universe, because I think when Deleuze and Guattari say, we don't like points, we like lines. They're basically saying that we have yet to learn that the relations have the capacity to produce the relata. In that sense, I'm thinking, any time that I think about this part-to-whole relationships, I think in a way that it's probably a false problem, because we have seen attempts at starting from bottom up or top down. Is it the whole that emanates its parts? Is it the parts that build the wholes? So that's why I find it very promising, this idea that Stavros was describing in terms of not mereology, part-to-whole relationship, but this mereotopology, how the boundaries are. How is it that the activity of drawing boundaries or producing boundaries or the permeability of the boundaries that actually relate what Simondon calls the interior-exterior milieu, of course, the very boundary as a special milieu, and for architectural purposes also the associated, the fourth milieu. So I think, and this fourth milieu, it comes back to the idea of the skin in the game, because it literally provides the sources of respiration, but also action perceptions, where we are driven by not what, but by value, and by value I mean all those things that are, all the virtualities that may or may not actualize, and this is very different from the possibilities that can be realized. So I'm thinking, I know that it sounds difficult, but it seems to me that we are, even our language breaks down because we are so used to thinking in terms of excluded middles, logic of the excluded middle. So I think we have to think, we have to ecologize thought, and by ecologizing thought, I mean we have to really start thinking in terms of the continuity and and I think I'll stop there, because I'm just getting deeper and deeper into.
Thank you, Andrej. Yeah.
I think that, I mean, what we didn't address, of course, was the other book, the Cybernetics and the Origins of Information. And I suspect that's where maybe the connections would come.
We can do it in one of the coming sessions.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And I think this is actually what Félix has been working on in his details as well, which is super interesting. And I think that information is really something that we're going to force to be addressed in terms of AI in the future. It's not about form; it's about informational systems and the way that the city of the future is going to not only different, but it's going to be controlled completely different. The example I always give is Uber. It doesn't look any different, but it operates in a fundamentally different way. So I think the question about information is going to be kind of crucial. But I also want to say something, which is that, in a way, I don't want to kind of break down too many boundaries, but I think some of the sort of discussion today is of part to whole and things. Just kind of, to my mind, the back of all this was this kind of theory of emergence and swarm intelligence, which I think is an incredibly useful thing. And I would just simply say that is also coming back into the world of AI in a kind of strange way. A lot of people moved from swarm intelligence towards AI as a natural progression, but what we're discovering are these so-called emergent capabilities of multi-agent systems, such as the large language models, that are allowing them to kind of to understand language, to translate languages, to write code, and to design, in my opinion. These are the things that are coming back, and they make it even more interesting because science cannot explain it. At the moment, it's just beyond us. John Holland writes about emergence, but we could observe it, but we can't explain it. So somehow I think that a lot of these debates will, maybe with a certain violence, will re-enter into the debate. But I absolutely, totally think that information theory is super important. And maybe we could, as Stavros suggests, we can have a session on that at some point.
If I can say just literally less than a minute. For me, the important, and I'm not gonna, a response to that question we try to give with Andrej, he mentioned it in this short text we wrote just recently. It's gonna be out in the next month called Annotate This. But for me, the important question, and everyone should try to at least wonder a bit that question and see what they come up with, is every kind of technology that we've been developing and has been developing us in return so far is automating something. I'm simplifying greatly now, but I'm trying to be fast. So every kind of technology we've developed so far, while it develops us, is automating something. The elevator automates what we used to do in the stairs. The toilet, the flush of the toilet automates a very laborious process of going down the river and throwing out our stuff there and picking up a bucket of water to return. So every kind of technology automates something. My question, and that's something that we can discuss and debate perhaps in another time, is what is that thing that AI automates? And I don't see very many efforts to respond to that, or very many, let's say, engagements to respond to that. We are all taking it for granted, but we are not really wondering what is that thing that this technology automates.
Well, I think there's a line. That's another.
Yeah.
What I would say, and this was maybe a plug for next Saturday's session. We're going to have a session on Digital Futures about Thora, which is this new open AI thing, which basically going from text to video, which is it is already groundbreaking in a perverse sort of way, and potentially it's kind of automating an entire metaverse, for example. And I would say would have an impact potentially in architecture if, as it seems to be operating in the kind of at least a three-dimensional rig, whether it's 3D as such. So that I think would be a huge debate, but absolutely, and there is software under development that is itself is going to automate much of the design process. But I mean, I think the problem is that we see it just in terms of what we got available now, which is to say Midjourney and so on. But it's what's in the pipeline that is going to be much more important. Mikhail, you want to add to it? Like
it's something I'm trying to think through at this point as well, but I'll leave it at that. I mean, I guess if we go on for a couple more minutes, we're going to crack the 3 hours, Neil.
Yeah. Well, I think what happened. I think what we've done is that by your own popularity, these kind of comments I'm getting from all over the place, we have to initiate another session maybe next year where we address some of these things, because I mean, a lot of these things, you've sowed a seed of a lot of ideas and questions, and some of my own students say, well, I'm just thinking about a question, I'm not ready yet. But I think this is so important to put it out there, to really open up an absolutely totally new debate about what's going on. And just as a kind of final thought, what I said before the session even started, I mean, the real problem, I think, has been the lack of access to this material in the past, because the Anglophone world doesn't speak French, apart from Canadians like Brian Masumi and Sanford Quinter. So and maybe AI is going to help in some way. Once we can be able to translate all this material, we will get access and open up, I think, something that stretches and contextualizes the so-called, the canonical thinkers that we've addressed. Because it seems to me here, one thing in terms of boundaries and limits we've kind of discussed is we're at the end of the forest. I mean, what we've discovered is Ruyer has to be in that overall kind of forest in some sense, and it's been an incredibly rich and provocative session that has sown the seeds for things for the future. I just wanted to thank Andrej and Stavros. Amazing. What you guys are doing, don't underestimate it. From the outside, it's absolutely fascinating. I commend you. An amazing initiative.
Thank you, Neil.
Delft.
Thank you very much.
And I also want to thank those who've asked questions in the thing, and also the Digital Futures team. And it's just an incredible thing that everyone is sharing their passion, giving their time for free on this platform to share knowledge out there, to bring it to all these people. We've had people in China, we've had people in Bangladesh and all over the world. So it's fantastic in Iran to be able to share that. So thank you so much. And to everybody, please join us Tuesday week, I think it's 27th of February. And then thereafter, we have every single Sunday. We've got a session on Merleau-Ponty. I think it's the next one following that, and so on. We will broadcast that, and bring your friends on board. We were trying to really, we're getting a bigger and bigger community to be involved on this. So, anyway, this was fabulous. Thank you,
Neil. Thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to the next one.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.